Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've always been a big fan of camping. There's something about escaping into the woods, miles away from civilization, that just feels right. Or it did, until last summer. I used to believe that the forest was a place of peace, a sanctuary away from the noise and chaos of the world. Now I know better. It started as an ordinary weekend camping trip. My friend Josh and I had planned to hike up to a remote spot in the Catskills that we'd read about online. It was supposed to be beautiful. Unspoiled nature, clear skies, and most importantly, absolutely no cell reception. We wanted to disconnect for a few days, breathe the fresh air, and maybe spot some wildlife. But what we found there was something no one could ever be prepared for. We arrived late in the afternoon, hiked a few hours, and finally reached a clearing just before sunset. The forest was thick, the kind where the trees seemed to huddle together, branches interlocking like they're conspiring to keep the sun out. It felt almost suffocating, but we brushed it off, setting up camp near a small stream. We built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and started sharing stories. Josh was telling some stupid ghost story when we both heard it, a rustling just beyond the circle of firelight. I remember pausing, staring into the darkness, and then Josh laughed, saying it was probably just a raccoon or something. I forced a laugh too, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. You know that feeling, when you're sure there are eyes on you, even if you can't see them? I shook it off, but that night I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing sounds, a snap of a twig, the low murmur of something that might have been wind but almost sounded vocal. It was like someone whispering, too low to understand, but close enough to send chills down my spine. The next day we decided to hike deeper into the woods. We'd only gone about a mile when we found the tracks. They were huge, like a wolf's, but wrong. Too long, too narrow, and with claw marks that dug deep into the earth. Josh thought they might belong to a bear, but I'd never seen bear tracks like these. Whatever it was, it had circled our campsite during the night. The tracks led away from our camp, disappearing into the dense underbrush, and for a moment I thought we should just turn back. But Josh insisted on pressing on. We continued our hike, and as we went deeper, the forest seemed to grow colder, darker, like the trees themselves were trying to swallow us. The air felt thick, damp, and there was this smell, like rot mixed with wet earth, but more sour, almost metallic. I remember thinking I'd never smelled anything like it, and I hoped I never would again. That evening, as we settled in for the night, I heard the noises again, louder this time and closer. It started with the rustling, but then I heard a low growl, followed by what I can only describe as a snarl, like an animal, but not any animal I'd ever heard before. Josh and I sat frozen, straining our ears, barely breathing. And then, just outside the firelight, I saw it. A figure, hunched over and gaunt, with glowing eyes that seemed to reflect the flames back at us. It was there 1 second and gone the next, disappearing into the shadows like smoke. Josh was brave, or stupid, enough to try and follow it. He grabbed his flashlight and darted into the darkness, ignoring my frantic whispers to come back. I didn't want to be alone, but I also didn't want to go after him. I stood there, heart racing, listening to his footsteps fading away. And then, silence. Complete, oppressive silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I heard Josh's scream. It was this horrible guttural sound, the kind that sticks with you long after you hear it. I ran toward the sound, yelling his name, stumbling through the trees until I found him. He was on the ground, clutching his leg, blood seeping through his fingers. He kept babbling about something he'd seen, something with claws, something with teeth. He kept saying, "It's not human. It's not human." I tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason, shaking and pale as a ghost. We hobbled back to camp, and I did my best to bandage his leg, but he wouldn't stop staring into the darkness, mumbling to himself. We stayed awake the rest of the night, barely speaking, barely moving, listening to the sounds around us, footsteps, scratching, growling. It circled us, just out of sight, like it was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. By morning, Josh was too weak to move, so I left him with our supplies and sprinted back to the car as fast as I could. I was terrified to leave him, but I didn't see another choice. I remember running, feeling like something was chasing me, hearing those awful sounds growing louder, closer, until I finally burst into the clearing where we'd parked. I grabbed my phone and was about to call for help when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the forest watching me was, I don't even know what it was. It was tall, with limbs that seemed too long, its eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural light. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, as it stared back at me with this twisted expression, almost like it was smiling. And then it spoke. I'll never forget those words. It didn't sound human, but it spoke English, in this gravelly, guttural voice that seemed to echo inside my head. It said, "You can't save him. He's already mine." I don't know how I managed to drive away, but somehow I did. When I got back with help, there was no trace of Josh, no trace of our campsite, no trace of anything. It was like we'd never been there. The only thing they found were those tracks leading deep into the forest and then disappearing, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. I still don't know what happened that weekend, or what kind of creature we encountered, but I can still hear its voice sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, and I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. I never thought a simple weekend camping trip would make me question my sanity, but here I am, alone, telling this story from a cramped cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. I'm not even sure if I'll get out of here, but if someone finds this recording, well, they'll know what happened to me. It all started with a weekend trip. My friends, Jake, Liv, and I had planned this camping trip for months. We were all city kids, itching for a taste of the wild. Jake had found this isolated campground through some website that promised authentic wilderness experiences. Little did we know how true that would be. The first night was as perfect as it gets. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the ground, while the birds sang their last songs of the day. We had the campfire crackling, marshmallows on sticks, and nothing but the rustling of leaves and distant animal calls for company. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. But then, as darkness swallowed the last sliver of daylight, something changed. The forest, which had felt so welcoming, suddenly seemed to close in around us. The sounds, too, had changed. There was a persistent rustling that didn't match the breeze, almost as if something or someone was circling us, hidden by the dense trees. Liv laughed it off, chalking it up to our overactive imaginations. "It's just the woods," she said, shrugging. "We're not used to it." Jake, ever the brave one, decided to mess with us. "You know, this area is supposed to be haunted," he said, his face lit ominously by the firelight. "The old folks around here talk about skinwalkers." He said the word like it was some punchline to a joke, but I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. After a while, we settled into our tents. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was awake, and it was pitch black. No firelight, no moonlight, just an endless black pressing against the thin walls of my tent. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper just outside. At first I thought it was Liv or Jake, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was neither of them. The voice was too low, too raspy, and it sounded wrong, like someone trying to mimic a human voice but missing the mark. "Help me," it whispered. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The voice grew louder, circling my tent, repeating those same 2 words. I wanted to scream, but fear held me paralyzed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voice faded and silence returned. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I stumbled out of the tent bleary-eyed and found Liv and Jake waiting by the fire pit. Both looked as bad as I felt, with dark circles under their eyes and faces pale as ghosts. Liv was the first to speak. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake and I exchanged a glance, both reluctant to admit what we'd heard, but then Jake nodded. "I heard something. I thought it was one of you." We didn't talk much that morning, the cheerful atmosphere from the night before replaced by a heavy, unspoken dread. After a quick breakfast, we decided to hike to the ranger station a few miles away to report the strange noises. Maybe they'd have an explanation, something that would ease our minds. The hike was tense, the forest felt different, each snap of a twig sending us into a panic. We barely spoke, our senses heightened, alert to every sound and shadow. Finally, after what felt like hours, we spotted the ranger station through the trees. But something was off. The building looked abandoned, windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. A faded park ranger's hat lay on the porch, dusty and weather-worn. We called out, but there was no answer. As we stepped inside, a foul odor hit us like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. The walls were covered in deep claw marks, and something dark and sticky pooled on the floor. It looked like blood, but I didn't want to think about that. Suddenly we heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Liv's eyes widened, and Jake motioned for us to stay quiet. We pressed ourselves against the wall, straining to listen. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the door. Then a voice, Jake's voice, called out, "Hey guys, where'd you go?" Jake's eyes widened in horror. He whispered, That's not me." The voice called out again, mimicking Jake perfectly, but now it sounded distorted, like it was coming from a broken radio. My skin prickled with fear as the thing outside circled the building, dragging its footsteps through the gravel. Liv looked at Jake, her face pale. "What is that?" Jake shook his head, his face as white as hers. It's a skinwalker. My grandma used to tell stories about them. They can take on your appearance, mimic your voice. They're supposed to lure people away, isolate them. We crouched there for what felt like hours, listening to that thing outside as it tried to coax us out, its voice shifting from Jake's to Liv's, then to mine. Each time it spoke, it sounded more human, more convincing. When the sun finally started to rise, the voice stopped. We stayed hidden until we were sure it was gone, then bolted from the ranger station, heading straight back to camp. We didn't speak, didn't stop, just kept moving until we were back in the clearing where our tents had been. Only the tents were gone. The fire pit was cold, with no sign we had ever been there. No footprints, no trash, nothing. Just an empty, undisturbed clearing. Liv started to cry, and Jake looked around, bewildered. This doesn't make any sense. We were right here. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving through the trees, watching us. My stomach dropped as it stepped into the light. It looked like me, but it wasn't. Its eyes were hollow, its skin too smooth, too perfect, like a poorly made mask. And then it smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin. We ran. I don't remember how long we ran or where we went, but somehow we made it back to this cabin. Now we're holed up here, waiting for daylight, hoping to find a way out of these woods. But every so often we hear footsteps outside, and the voices start again. It's been hours since I heard Liv or Jake say anything. I'm starting to think. Maybe they never made it back to the cabin. Maybe I'm not alone here after all. The forest was still. Not the peaceful kind of still where you could hear the birds and the rustling leaves. This was an oppressive, unnatural quiet, like something heavy and watchful had settled over the trees. I'd been hiking for hours, miles off the usual paths, hoping to find a hidden lake I'd read about online. I'd left just before dawn, wanting to be alone in the woods before anyone else arrived. Now, as the afternoon shadows stretched, I found myself wondering if that had been a mistake. I'd never seen trees like these before. They were taller and older than I expected, twisted and gnarled like the hands of ancient giants. I hadn't seen any animals for hours, and the forest floor was covered with a thick layer of moss that muffled my footsteps. Everything seemed a little too quiet, a little too still, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A faint rustling, almost too soft to notice. I stopped and listened, scanning the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but something about the sound felt wrong, too deliberate, as if it were waiting for me to move before it moved too. My heartbeat quickened as the rustling continued, closer now, and I strained my ears trying to locate it. But it was as if the sound was circling me, coming from all sides at once. Suddenly I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but whatever it was had already vanished. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing more than a bird or squirrel darting through the underbrush, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was hiding just beyond my sight. I started walking again, faster this time, scanning the trees with every step. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing just ahead on the trail. It was tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in shadows, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure tilted its head, and I could swear it was looking right at me, though I couldn't make out any features. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I thought I saw. But the figure was still there in my mind's eye, looming and unnatural, like something that didn't belong in this world. I turned and started to walk, then run, back the way I'd come, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't find my way back to the spot where I'd started. It was as if the forest had shifted around me, swallowing up the path I thought I knew so well. As I ran, I heard a voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words were soft, almost a sigh, but they filled me with a chill that settled deep in my bones. I stopped, my head whipping around, trying to find the source, but the trees were empty, still, and silent once more. I took a few steps forward, then froze. There, etched into the bark of a tree, was a symbol. It looked like an eye, with long, jagged lines radiating outward. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. It felt ancient, wrong, as if it didn't belong to this world. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the rough bark, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was again, the figure. Closer this time, so close I could almost make out its face, though it was shrouded in shadows. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing and unblinking, and it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The growl grew louder, filling the air with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, and turned to run, sprinting as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever that thing was. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on, desperate and terrified. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending as if they were alive, reaching out to grab me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst into a clearing. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around, hoping to see some sign of civilization, but instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a circle of stones. They were old and weathered, covered in moss and lichen, but they were arranged too perfectly to be natural. I stepped closer, my eyes drawn to the center of the circle where a small twisted figure lay. It looked like a doll, made of sticks and twine. But as I stared at it, I realized that it was pulsing, as if it were alive. I took a step back, my foot catching on a root, and as I stumbled, I heard the voice again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me, pressing in from all sides. I looked up, and there, at the edge of the clearing, were dozens of figures, all identical to the one I'd seen before. They stood motionless, their eyes glowing yellow, their mouths twisted into unnatural, predatory smiles. I backed away, my hands shaking, and the figures began to move, closing in around me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and I realized with horror that the stones of the circle were sinking, pulling me down with them. I struggled, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The figures drew closer, their faces blank and hollow, their hands reaching out as if to drag me down with them. As I felt myself sinking, I looked up one last time and saw a familiar face among the figures. It was the park ranger, the one who'd warned me about the stories. She stood there, her eyes glowing yellow, her smile too wide, too sharp, and I knew then that there was no escape. The forest had claimed me, just as it had claimed her, and 1,000 others before us. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the faint, mocking echo of that whisper, "You shouldn't have come." It's funny how we go looking for adventure in places we think we understand. That was my first mistake. If I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods, I'd have never taken that job. But it's too late for regrets now. It started last summer, when I picked up a gig as a seasonal park ranger in a small, obscure park out in Colorado. The place was a well-kept secret, rarely visited by tourists, and honestly, I thought I'd be dealing with little more than lonely hikers and the occasional lost camper. I couldn't have been more wrong. I got the late shift on my first night. Lucky me, right? My supervisor, an old-timer named Bill, gave me a flashlight, a radio, and a beat-up map of the trails. "Stay on the main path, stick to the marked trails," he said, his voice gravely serious. "And if you hear anything strange, ignore it." "Strange like what?" I asked, thinking he was just trying to mess with the new guy. He didn't answer, just gave me a look that was somewhere between pity and fear. "Just stay on the trail," he repeated, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the station as the sun dipped below the horizon. So I set off, following the dirt path that wound through the thick forest. As the last light faded, the woods became a maze of shadows, and I found myself jumping at every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was unnerving, but I tried to shrug it off. This was my job, after all. I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. About an hour into my patrol, I started hearing something else. At first, it was just a soft whisper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. I paused, straining to listen, but it was gone. Probably the wind, I told myself, though the excuse felt hollow. I kept walking, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was all around me now, weaving through the trees like some kind of twisted melody. I couldn't make out any words, just a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to pulse with the beating of my heart. I tried to radio Bill, but all I got was static. My flashlight flickered, and a wave of cold air washed over me. I looked around, suddenly aware that I had no idea where I was. The trail markers were gone, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I was about to turn back when I saw something ahead, a faint light, bobbing through the trees. Relief flooded through me. Another ranger, maybe, or a late-night hiker. I called out, but the light didn't stop. It just kept moving, weaving through the forest like it was leading me somewhere. Against my better judgment, I followed it. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just desperate for some sign of civilization. The light led me deeper into the woods, winding through narrow paths and over fallen logs until I found myself in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, surrounded by a circle of old weathered stones. The fire was out, but the embers were still glowing, casting an eerie red light across the clearing. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them circling the fire pit in a chaotic pattern. Some were human, but others looked like animal tracks, deep and clawed, unlike anything I'd ever seen. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the tracks didn't just circle the pit, they led away from it, disappearing into the trees on the other side of the clearing. I wanted to turn back, to run, but something compelled me to follow. I took a step forward, then another, my feet sinking into the damp earth as I moved toward the edge of the clearing. And that's when I saw her. She was standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in shadow. Her back was to me, but I could see enough to know that something was very, very wrong. Her limbs were too long, her movements too fluid, like she was made of water instead of flesh and bone. Her head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and her skin was pale, almost translucent, glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. She turned, her face coming into view, and I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through me. She opened her mouth and a low guttural sound escaped her lips like the growl of some wild animal. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The woman, or whatever she was, took a step toward me, her limbs twisting and contorting in ways that should have been impossible. I scrambled to my feet, but she was already there, her face inches from mine. And then she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, soft and cold, but I could understand the words. "Help me," she said, her empty eyes locking onto mine. "Help me find my face." I bolted, running through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station, my lungs burning and my mind racing. Bill was there, waiting for me, his face pale. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed, shaking his head. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." I quit the next day, packed up my things, and left that park without looking back. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice again, whispering through the darkness, asking me to help her find her face. And I know that somehow, some way, she's still out there, waiting in the shadows. I used to think I knew the woods like the back of my hand. I grew up in a small town where the forest was a place of adventure, not fear. But last fall, when I volunteered to help with a search and rescue operation in the dense woods of northern Montana, I learned how wrong I was. The call came in just after dusk. A young couple, tourists from out of state, had gone missing while camping. Their last known location was somewhere along the Ridgeway Trail, a path notorious for its steep drops and dense trees. The trail was supposed to be closed off for the season, but every year, a few people ignored the signs, convinced they could handle it. Most made it back just fine. These two didn't. By the time our team gathered and got to the trailhead, the sun had set, and the forest was drenched in darkness. We split up, each group taking a different section of the trail, armed with flashlights, radios, and enough gear to last the night. My partner Sam was a veteran in the search and rescue game, and he seemed unfazed as we set off down the trail. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals, faded into an eerie silence. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trees and underbrush, but somehow the beams seemed swallowed up by the night. I tried to shake off the unease settling in my stomach, reminding myself that fear was the enemy of focus. About an hour in, we found the couple's tent. It was pitched in a small clearing just off the trail, partially collapsed and abandoned. There was no sign of a struggle, but their belongings were scattered, as if they'd left in a hurry. I knelt down to examine the ground, looking for tracks, but something else caught my eye. On the edge of the clearing, carved into the trunk of a tree, was a symbol, a circle with an X through it. It looked freshly made, the bark still raw and exposed. I reached out to touch it, but Sam grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't," he said, his face grim. I've seen that before. I raised an eyebrow, confused. What is it? He didn't answer, just shook his head and motioned for us to keep moving. Reluctantly, I followed him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. We pushed deeper into the woods, calling out the couple's names every few minutes. There was no response, just that suffocating silence pressing in on all sides. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. It was static at first, but then I heard a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. Help, us. I froze, gripping the radio tightly. This is Ranger Davis. Can you hear me? What's your location? More static, followed by another whisper. Help, trapped, can't find the way. Sam grabbed the radio from me, his face pale. Who is this? Are you the missing campers? The radio crackled again, then fell silent. Sam and I exchanged a look, the weight of unspoken fears hanging between us. Without a word, we pressed on, moving faster now, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the missing couple. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was different, wrong, somehow. The trees around it were dead, their twisted branches bare and reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. In the center of the clearing was an old dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls warped and covered in moss. I didn't know there were cabins out here, I whispered, more to myself than to Sam. There aren't, he replied, his voice barely audible. He took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Wait, this doesn't feel right. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw fear in his eyes. We have to check it out. They might be inside. Reluctantly, I nodded, and we approached the cabin, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Our flashlights swept over the room, revealing old furniture, shattered windows, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. Then, in the far corner, I saw them, the couple. They were huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. But something was wrong. They were too still, too silent, like they were frozen in time. Are you okay? I asked, taking a step toward them. But as the beam of my flashlight fell across their faces, I saw the truth. Their skin was gray, almost translucent, their eyes empty and hollow. They looked like they'd been there for decades, their bodies desiccated and skeletal. But that was impossible. They'd only been missing for a day. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from behind me. I turned, my flashlight catching a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. It was tall, hunched over, its limbs twisted and elongated, with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. Sam grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the door. We ran, bursting out of the cabin and back into the clearing, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. But the thing was right behind us, its footsteps pounding the ground like a heartbeat. We sprinted through the woods, the branches clawing at us as we stumbled down the trail. The growls grew fainter, and for a moment I thought we'd lost it. But then I saw them. Those same symbols carved into the trees, marking a path that twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the forest. Sam stopped, his face pale, and looked at me. "It's leading us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wants us to go further in." "We have to go back," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We have to get out of here." But as we turned to retrace our steps, the symbols reappeared, like they were following us, shifting with every turn. It was as if the forest itself was alive, twisting and warping, trapping us in an endless loop. We walked for hours, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. Time felt warped, stretched thin and frayed at the edges. Eventually we stumbled into another clearing, and I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. It was the same clearing, the same dead trees, the same twisted cabin waiting in the center. Only this time, there were two more figures inside, two figures that looked exactly like us. My heart stopped as I realized what I was looking at. The figures were frozen, just like the couple, their faces pale and eyes hollow, staring back at us with a silent, unending scream. I turned to Sam, but he was gone, and then, as I looked back toward the cabin, I saw him, inside, standing beside that other version of me, his eyes empty, his face twisted in terror. And now, as I sit here in this endless forest trapped between reality and whatever this place is, I know one thing for sure. There's no way out. The forest doesn't let you go. It just takes you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but shadows. And somewhere out there, something is watching, waiting to take my place, to lure the next poor soul deeper into the woods. If you're listening to this, don't come looking for me. Don't follow the whispers. And for the love of God, don't step off the trail, because once you do, there's no coming back. I hadn't wanted to go camping. The others thought it'd be fun, one last adventure before we all went our separate ways. I had reluctantly agreed, lured by the promise of fresh air and the chance to unplug from everything for a while. That, and the fact that Tom, my best friend since childhood, had practically dragged me along, saying it'd be just like old times. We drove out early, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the sun struggled to pierce through the canopy. By the time we set up camp, I realized I had no idea where we were, just an endless sea of green surrounding us, suffocating and vast. It was only after we settled in that Tom mentioned the ranger. He came by when I scouted this spot last weekend, he said nonchalantly, told me some creepy stuff about the area. Like what? I asked, mostly to humor him. Oh, you know, the usual, legends, creatures, skinwalkers. Thought he was messing with me, honestly. Said he'd been working here for over 20 years and he'd seen things in these woods. But then he just walked away. Gave me the chills. Tom chuckled, but there was something forced about it. Skinwalkers. I'd heard about them in ghost stories, tales shared around campfires to spook kids. But hearing it here, in the depths of the forest, made it feel different. I shrugged it off, though. Legends are just that. Legends. We sat around the fire that night, listening to the sounds of the forest. The night was eerily still, as though even the nocturnal creatures were holding their breath. I felt an inexplicable sense of dread creeping in, but I didn't say anything. Tom and the others would just laugh. It must have been around midnight when the ranger appeared. He was tall, with a broad-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow. His uniform was outdated, like something from decades ago, and he didn't seem to carry any of the usual equipment. No flashlight, no radio. Just him, standing at the edge of our camp, as if he'd materialized out of thin air. "Evening," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Y'all doing all right out here?" There was something in his eyes that unsettled me, a sharpness, a predatory glint. Tom, oblivious as always, waved him over. I tried to ignore the prickling feeling crawling up my spine as the ranger approached and squatted beside our fire, his face half lit by the flickering flames. "You folks picked a bad spot," he murmured, glancing around at the shadows stretching into the trees. "Strange things happen here." "What kind of strange things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The ranger's gaze flicked to me. Things you wouldn't believe. People disappearing. Some found later, wandering, confused, not quite themselves. Others, never found at all. I forced a laugh. "You trying to scare us?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, a slow, unsettling smile stretching across his face. Then he stood up and melted back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he'd appeared. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt amplified, as though the forest itself were alive, watching, waiting. I kept seeing the ranger's face in my mind, that eerie smile, the cold glint in his eyes. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that we were safe. But the feeling lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me. The next morning I woke to find Tom gone. His sleeping bag lay empty beside the fire and his boots were still there. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. The others thought he'd just wandered off, maybe gone to relieve himself. But I knew something was wrong. We spent the day searching, calling his name until our voices grew hoarse, but the forest swallowed every sound. It was as if he'd been erased. By nightfall, I was desperate. I thought about the ranger, about his strange warning, and a horrible suspicion began to take root. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom returned. Or rather, something that looked like Tom. He stumbled into camp, his movements stiff, unnatural, like he was being controlled by some invisible puppet strings. His face was slack, and his eyes, they weren't his eyes. They were empty, devoid of that familiar spark. "What happened to you?" I whispered, taking a step back. He just stared at me, unblinking. When he spoke, his voice was wrong, too, flat, hollow, as though he were repeating words he'd heard 100 times before. "You shouldn't have come here. It's too late now." I felt a cold hand grip my heart as I realized he was mimicking the ranger's words, almost verbatim. I took another step back, and his gaze followed, a slow, deliberate movement that made my skin crawl. The others tried to talk to him, but he just kept repeating those words over and over, his voice growing more distorted, more inhuman with each repetition. Finally, one of the others touched him, and he snapped, lunging forward with a feral snarl. We scrambled away, terrified, as he thrashed and convulsed on the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He lay still, his chest rising and falling shallowly, his face blank, expressionless. I wanted to run, to get away from him, from this cursed forest, but something held me back. I had to know what had happened to my friend. As I watched him lying there, the truth finally clicked. He wasn't Tom, not anymore. Something had taken him, twisted him, hollowed him out. The ranger's warning echoed in my mind, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the legend was true. A skinwalker had found us. When he opened his eyes again, they weren't empty anymore. They were watching me, knowing, almost mocking. I realized then that it hadn't been a chance encounter with the ranger. It had been a trap. He'd led us here, lured us to this place, and now he was claiming his prize. I don't know what happened to the others. I ran, stumbling through the dark, hearing footsteps echoing behind me, always just a little too close. I've been running ever since, but I know I'll never escape, because the ranger is out there watching, waiting, and he'll never let me go. It was never about the skinwalker. The ranger had been one all along, and I walked right into his trap. The moment we arrived at Blackwood Forest, a sense of unease settled over me. There were 4 of us, me, my sister Jane, her boyfriend Mike, and our friend Sam. We'd chosen this spot specifically because it was off the beaten path, a place not listed on any campground directory. It was supposed to be the ultimate getaway. But as we trudged deeper into the dense woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was dense and dark, even during the day, the kind of place where sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. It smelled earthy and damp, and the air was so thick it almost felt like breathing through a cloth. We set up camp beside an old dried-up creek bed, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. As we unpacked, a rustling from the trees made us pause. Out of the woods emerged a park ranger, wearing an old, faded uniform that looked like it had seen decades of service. He was tall, with a hollow face, sunken eyes, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded most of his features. He stood at the edge of our camp, watching us with a kind of detachment, like he was sizing us up. "Didn't think anyone camped out here anymore," he said in a raspy voice, barely louder than a whisper. "Most folks avoid this part of the forest." Jane, always the polite one, greeted him, trying to break the tension. "Is there something we should know about? We read the maps, and there wasn't anything saying we shouldn't be here." The ranger just stared at her for a moment before saying, "Locals have a story. They say something walks these woods, something that can take the form of anyone it sees. The older folks call it a skinwalker." His gaze shifted to each of us as if he was letting his words sink in. Sam, of course, was skeptical. He let out a laugh and said, "You're just trying to scare us. I've heard all the legends. Skinwalkers, wendigos, ghosts. They're just stories." But the ranger didn't laugh. He simply nodded, a solemn look passing over his face, and turned back toward the trees. "Just be careful," he said over his shoulder, before disappearing into the forest without another word. We all shared a nervous laugh once he was gone, dismissing his warning as an attempt to mess with us. We'd driven hours to get here, and none of us were about to leave because of some creepy story. So we settled in, built a fire, and tried to shake off the eerie encounter. By the time night fell, we were laughing, sharing stories, pretending we hadn't been rattled by the ranger. But as the fire crackled and the woods grew silent, the atmosphere changed. Every sound seemed amplified, every gust of wind like a whisper of something just out of sight. Mike was the first to notice it. He pointed out that the usual nighttime sounds had vanished. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing but the crackling fire and our own uneasy breaths. Around midnight we heard footsteps. At first we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside the circle of light cast by our fire. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but all we could see were shadows, the beams of light swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes gleaming in the darkness. They were human eyes, but there was something wrong about them, something that made my skin crawl. They were too reflective, too knowing. Before I could say anything, Jane gasped. The figure stepped into the light, and we all froze. It was the ranger, only he didn't look quite right. His face was the same, but his movements were stiff, unnatural, as if he were trying to remember how to walk. He stood just beyond the reach of the firelight, staring at us with that unnerving, hollow gaze. "Didn't I tell you folks to leave?" he said, his voice hollow, echoing oddly among the trees. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to look at the others, to see if they were as terrified as I was, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. And then, without warning, he began to change. His limbs twisted and elongated, his skin rippling like water, his face distorted, melting and reforming into something else entirely. Sam. I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature was now wearing Sam's face, mimicking his posture, his expressions. It was grotesque, like a bad imitation of something that had once been human. Sam was right beside me, staring at the creature with wide eyes, his own face pale and drawn. That's impossible," he stammered, backing away. But the creature just smirked, tilting its head to the side as it began to mimic his voice, repeating his last words like a mocking echo. Panicking, we all scrambled to our feet, backing away from the creature as it started to advance, its movements jerky and unnatural. Jane grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice, and whispered, "We have to get out of here." We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and ran, stumbling through the underbrush, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we tore through the forest. I could hear it behind us, following, its footsteps too fast, too close. It wasn't running, it was gliding, its unnatural form slipping through the trees with impossible ease. When we finally broke through the tree line, the creature was gone. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, piling in and locking the doors as if that would somehow protect us. The forest was silent once more, but I could still feel its eyes on us, watching, waiting. We drove back in silence, none of us daring to speak, too afraid to look at each other for fear of what we might see. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, Mike broke the silence. "Did that really happen?" None of us answered. We didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to believe that we had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist. But as we sped away from Blackwood Forest, I glanced back, half expecting to see the ranger standing at the edge of the trees watching us go. There was nothing. Just shadows and the lingering sense that we had left a piece of ourselves behind in those woods. a piece that the Skinwalker now wore like a trophy. I haven't spoken to the others since that night. I'm not even sure I could recognize them if I saw them, because sometimes late at night I catch my own reflection in the mirror, and I wonder if it's really me looking back. The forest was darker than I expected, not just the kind of dark where your eyes adjust and things start to make sense. This was a suffocating, pressing blackness that made you doubt if you'd ever seen light at all. I was a couple of miles deep into the pine forest, far from the trailhead, and already the weight of isolation was heavy. My campsite was modest, just a small tent, a crackling fire, and the distant echoes of the world I'd left behind. No phone signal, no road noise, just the endless whisper of the trees. I'd come here seeking solitude, something to break the monotony of my day-to-day life. The rangers at the entrance had mentioned the trails were lightly trafficked, which was exactly what I wanted. But even then, there had been a look in their eyes when I said I planned to stay overnight, a look that lingered on the edge of warning. "Be sure you're back before dark," one of them had said, his voice steady but oddly cautious. I had brushed it off as standard park ranger advice, a way to keep rookies from getting lost in the maze of trees. Now, though, their caution seemed to echo in the darkness around me. As the fire settled into a rhythm of popping embers and soft glows, I noticed the silence. It was a silence that wasn't quite empty but rather filled with something just beyond hearing. The kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Now and then, a gust of wind would shake the branches, but there were no animal sounds. Not a single rustle, no distant owl calls, nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, listening. Around midnight I decided to turn in. My tent was a flimsy barrier, but it was all I had, so I crawled in, zipped up, and lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistle. It wasn't close, but it carried through the trees with an unsettling clarity. I held my breath, listening. Then came another whistle, this time closer, as if whoever or whatever was making it was moving toward me. At first, I told myself it had to be the wind or maybe another camper playing some late-night prank. But the whistles were too deliberate, spaced just far enough apart to suggest intent. They were coming from different directions now, circling my campsite in a way that felt more like stalking than coincidence. I strained my ears, hoping to catch some sign of what it was. A voice, a footstep, anything. But the silence was impenetrable, broken only by that eerie whistle, moving around me like a predator. I don't know how long I lay there, every muscle in my body tense and ready to bolt. The whistling would stop for long stretches, and I'd start to relax, only for it to pick up again, closer each time. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, slipped out, and crouched low by the embers of my dying fire. The forest was a wall of blackness around me, and in that moment I felt as small as a mouse under the gaze of a hawk. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, something moved. It was barely a shadow, just a blur of motion against the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out. A deer, maybe? But as I watched, it shifted, and a sliver of moonlight caught its face, or rather what should have been a face. It was as if someone had pulled a rough mask of animal hide over a human head, eye holes hollow and empty. The figure was tall, taller than any human I'd ever seen, its limbs impossibly long and bending at strange angles, like a marionette with broken strings. It took a step closer, and I realized that its eyes weren't empty holes at all. They were filled with a glistening, predatory hunger that felt far too aware. I was frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head the way a dog might when it's curious, and then it opened its mouth. That's when I heard it. The same whistle, now deafening and unbearably close, like it was mocking me. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I went. just needing to put distance between myself and whatever that was. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my arms and legs as I stumbled through the underbrush. Every so often, I'd hear the whistle again, always just behind me, keeping pace. No matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just out of sight. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning as I plunged deeper into the woods, far from any recognizable path. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I burst into a clearing. There, in the middle, stood a small cabin. Relief washed over me as I saw light seeping from the windows, like a beacon in the dark. I stumbled to the door, banging on it with everything I had left in me. "Please, let me in," I gasped, half sobbing with fear. The door swung open, and a park ranger stood there, his face etched with a mix of concern and something else, something that almost looked like pity. He pulled me inside, shutting the door firmly behind me. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words came out in a frantic jumble. He just nodded, his face growing paler as he listened. When I finally stopped, he took a deep breath and said, "You weren't supposed to be out here alone. There are things in these woods that you can't understand. Things that don't take kindly to strangers." I shivered, feeling the warmth of the cabin start to seep into my bones. What was that?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. He hesitated, then looked me straight in the eye. "Some call them skinwalkers. Others have different names for them, but they've been here far longer than we have, and they like to play with those who wander too far from safety." I opened my mouth to respond, but a sound cut me off, a high-pitched whistle echoing from just outside the cabin walls. My heart dropped, and I turned to the ranger, who was now staring at the door with a look of horror. "They're not supposed to follow you here," he whispered almost to himself. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew that whatever this place was, it wasn't safe, not anymore. The ranger reached for something behind the door, a rifle or so I thought, but instead he pulled out a strange, ancient-looking mask. He slipped it over his head, and his entire posture changed, his limbs growing longer, his face twisting into that same hollow-eyed expression I'd seen before. And then it hit me. The man I'd followed wasn't a ranger at all. I stumbled back, my mind reeling as he took a step toward me, the whistle now filling the cabin like a shrieking wind. I turned and bolted through the door, plunging back into the endless, merciless dark, with the sound of that haunting whistle echoing in my ears. I don't remember much after that, just fragments of trees, shadows, and that endless, suffocating fear. When I finally stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and battered, I found myself back at the trailhead. The real ranger was there, his face pale as he saw me. I tried to explain, but he just shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive," he said quietly. "Most don't come back after seeing them." And as I drove away, I looked back one last time. At the edge of the forest, I thought I saw a figure watching, hollow eyes gleaming. And then, just as I turned away, I heard it, the faintest whistle, drifting through the trees. I still don't know what was real and what wasn't, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back into those woods again. I needed a break. Life in the city was suffocating, and I craved a few days in the wilderness where I could disconnect and breathe. I'd heard about a lesser-known campground deep in the Blackwood National Forest, miles from any sign of civilization. It sounded perfect, just me, the trees, and the crisp autumn air, or so I thought. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees by the time I arrived at the trailhead. I noticed the small beat-up ranger station on the edge of the parking lot. As I walked up to it, a ranger stepped out, an older man with grizzled hair and a stern expression. "Camping?" he asked, sizing me up. "Yes, sir, just a couple of nights," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. There was something in his gaze that made me uneasy. "Stick to the marked trails and keep close to your campsite," he warned, almost as if he knew something I didn't. "The woods get strange this time of year." I thanked him and continued down the path, his words echoing in my head. but I brushed them off as the usual warnings you'd expect. After all, I wasn't some novice hiker. I found a nice spot about a mile in, just off the main trail near a quiet brook. The trees were thick here, their branches tangled together, blocking out most of the sky. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for a peaceful night. As the stars began to peek through the canopy, I felt the tension from the city finally melt away. Then the sounds began. At first it was just a rustling in the underbrush, which I dismissed as some small animal foraging. But then I heard a low guttural howl in the distance. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost human. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned in early, hoping to sleep off the unease. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. The howl, much closer this time, followed by a strange shuffling sound outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The shuffling stopped, and then came the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam did little to pierce the darkness. My heart raced as I listened, and then in a moment of pure terror, I heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to crawl up my spine. "Get out!" I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, desperate to flee, but the breathing outside grew louder, more insistent. I felt trapped, frozen with fear. And then the voice came again, this time louder, angrier. "Get out!" I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the darkness, expecting to see an animal, or maybe even a person. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows stretching endlessly in every direction. I grabbed my backpack, determined to leave, but as I turned around, I saw something at the edge of my light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and a hunched back. Its eyes glowed yellow, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. And its face was wrong. It was twisted, with features that seemed to shift and blur, like it couldn't decide on a single shape. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and the creature let out a low growl that shook the ground beneath me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I could hear it following me, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, always just out of sight. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes and tearing at my skin as I ran. Finally, I burst into a small clearing, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. I looked around, desperate for any sign of safety, and that's when I saw it. An old, decrepit cabin, half hidden by the undergrowth. I knew it was a terrible idea, but I had no choice. I ran to the cabin and threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. The cabin was empty, just a single room with a broken table and a few scattered pieces of furniture. The windows were cracked, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. I huddled in the corner, listening as the footsteps approached. The creature stopped outside, its breathing filling the silence. And then, to my horror, I heard it speak again, but this time in my own voice. "Get out," it whispered, mimicking my panic, my desperation. "Get out." I closed my eyes, praying it would leave, but the door creaked open, and I knew it was inside with me. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing down on me. I opened my eyes, and there it was, standing in the doorway, watching me with those unblinking yellow eyes. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying outside, the cabin nowhere in sight. I stumbled back to the trail and found my way to the parking lot, where the ranger was waiting. He looked at me, his face grim, and simply nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. I nodded, too shaken to speak. "People don't come back from Blackwood once they see it. It lets them leave, but they never really get away." I left without saying another word, but even now, I still feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows. I can hear my own voice whispering in the back of my mind, repeating those words that will haunt me forever. Get out. Because part of me knows I never really did. Not all of me, anyway. A piece of me is still out there, wandering the woods, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to step into Blackwood's grasp. And I know that one day I'll be back, drawn by that call, helpless to resist. I'd been planning the trip for months, a solo hike along an old, barely used trail that wound through the rugged mountains and dense forests of the northern ridge. The trail was unmarked, almost forgotten, and that was exactly what I wanted. It was a chance to get away from everything, to truly disconnect. I set out early, the morning sun casting a soft golden light over the forest. The air was fresh, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine. For the first few miles, everything was perfect. I walked in silence, surrounded by towering trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. The trail twisted and turned, narrowing as I went deeper into the woods. I felt like I was stepping into another world, one that hadn't been touched by human hands for a very long time. By midday, I reached a small clearing and decided to rest. I ate a quick meal and checked my map, but something about it seemed off. The landmarks didn't match up with what I was seeing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd taken a wrong turn. I chalked it up to my own inexperience and kept moving, convinced I'd find the right path soon enough. But as the hours passed, I started to notice subtle changes in the forest. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled in unnatural ways. The air turned heavy, filled with an eerie silence that swallowed up the sounds of birds and insects. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, an old wooden sign half buried in the ground, the paint faded and peeling. I brushed away some dirt and squinted at the faded letters. Devil's Hollow. The name struck a chord somewhere deep in my memory. I remembered hearing something about it, a legend maybe, or a warning, but I was too far in to turn back now. As I pressed on, I came across strange things. Stones piled in small stacks along the trail, each one balancing precariously. At first I thought they were markers, but they seemed too deliberate, almost like offerings. I walked a little faster, telling myself it was just some odd local tradition. But then I found the footprints. They were large, impossibly large, with clawed toes that dug deep into the earth. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't human. I froze, listening, but there was only the silence, heavy and oppressive. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't remember the way I'd come. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes scanning the shadows, every nerve on edge. As the daylight began to fade, I stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin nestled between the trees. The wood was rotting, and the windows were covered in thick grime. I thought about passing it by, but the shadows were growing longer, and I needed shelter. The cabin was worse inside. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood in a language I didn't recognize. I stepped further in, my flashlight illuminating more bizarre markings, and noticed something on the floor, a tattered journal. I picked it up and with a trembling hand began to read. The entries were frantic, scrawled in barely legible handwriting. They told the story of a man who had hiked this trail years ago, drawn by the same desire to escape, to disappear. He'd written about the stones, the silence, and the footprints. His last entry was the worst of all. It's watching me. I can feel it in my bones. I tried to leave, but every path brings me back to this cursed cabin. I see it in the shadows, its eyes glowing. I don't know how much longer I can keep it at bay. If you find this, please, don't look into its eyes. I dropped the journal, my heart pounding. I could feel it, that same presence he'd described. I turned to leave, but as I stepped outside, I saw it. Just beyond the trees, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. They were impossibly tall, staring down at me unblinking. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The creature stepped forward, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was massive, with limbs that looked almost human, but stretched and distorted, like it had been molded from shadows and nightmares. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of animal and human, with sharp teeth that glinted in the dying light. I forced myself to look away, remembering the journal's warning. I ran, stumbling through the trees, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from those eyes. But every time I thought I'd gotten away, I'd find myself back at the cabin, the same journal lying on the floor, the same symbols staring back at me from the walls. I don't know how many times I tried to escape that night. The creature followed me, its footsteps echoing through the trees, always just behind me, always watching. I lost all sense of time, my world shrinking to a twisted loop of fear and despair. At some point, I must have blacked out because I woke up at the edge of the trail, just as dawn was breaking. The cabin was gone, the forest around me calm and quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. But the footprints were still there, clawed and impossibly large, leading away from me into the woods. I never went back to that trail. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with people, with noise, anything to drown out the memory of those eyes. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still see them, glowing in the darkness, waiting, watching. And I know that if I ever step into those woods again, I won't make it out. Because the forest doesn't forget, and neither does whatever hunts within it. I was deep into the wilderness, alone on a trail I hadn't seen marked on any map. It was the kind of path that felt hidden on purpose, swallowed by dense underbrush and tall, ancient trees whose branches twisted together to block out most of the sunlight. I hadn't meant to stray so far, but I had an inexplicable urge to keep walking, as if something was pulling me along. I was no stranger to solo hikes, but this felt different. The forest had an uncanny stillness to it, a heavy, almost oppressive quiet that settled over me like a weight. I'd been warned, of course. The park ranger at the entrance station had given me a strange look when I asked for trail recommendations. "Be careful out there," she'd said, her voice low and serious. "These woods have stories." I'd brushed her off, eager to get going. I loved stories about haunted woods and legends that lurked beyond the reach of the ordinary world. I thought it would add to the thrill. But as I moved deeper into the forest, I began to feel uneasy. The kind of unease that starts as a tickle at the back of your neck and soon grows into a knot in your stomach. It was the sudden absence of sound that first caught my attention. The birds had gone silent, and even the rustle of small animals seemed to fade away. I stopped and took in my surroundings. Massive trees surrounded me on all sides, their bark rough and dark as if scorched by old fires. The shadows between them seemed to shift, writhing in a way that made me blink, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a soft humming drifting through the trees. It was faint, almost melodic, but it sent a shiver through me. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, more like a voice, though there were no words. The hum seemed to echo, growing louder as it reverberated through the forest, but it was impossible to tell which direction it was coming from. I took a step back, but the humming followed, growing louder and more insistent. It was then I realized that I wasn't alone. There, just at the edge of my vision, something moved between the trees, a figure half hidden in the shadows. I squinted, trying to make it out, but it seemed to blend into the dark, as if it was made of the forest itself. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally elongated, with fingers that seemed to taper off into pointed claws. I could just barely make out the shape of its face, which was obscured by what looked like a hood made of rough, dark fur. But the eyes, its eyes were what held me rooted to the spot. They glowed, a pale, sickly yellow that seemed to pierce straight through the shadows and into me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. The humming grew louder, more insistent, filling my head until it was the only thing I could hear. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the sound only intensified, drilling into my skull like a swarm of angry bees. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was closer, impossibly close. It was as if it had glided through the trees without making a sound. I took a shaky breath, finally finding the strength to move, and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. The creature tilted its head, watching me with those glowing eyes, and a smile spread across its face. But there was something wrong with that smile. It was too wide, too stretched, as if the skin on its face barely contained the bones beneath. "Why are you here?" a voice whispered, though the creature's mouth didn't move. The words seemed to come from the trees themselves, rustling through the leaves and settling around me like a cold mist. I was just hiking," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure's smile widened even more, and it took a step closer. I could see its face clearly now, and I realized that it wasn't wearing a hood at all. The dark fur I'd seen was actually part of its skin, matted and tangled like the coat of a dead animal left to rot. I took another step back, but my heel hit something hard. I turned, glancing down, and felt my stomach drop. It was an old sign, weathered and broken, barely legible, but I could just make out the words carved into the wood. "Danger, do not enter." I'd seen signs like this before, marking old trails that had been closed for safety reasons, but this one looked ancient, as if it had been forgotten long before the park even existed. I looked back up, and the figure was gone. The humming had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I knew I had to leave, but when I turned to retrace my steps, the trail was gone. I spun around, searching for any familiar landmark, but the trees all looked the same, stretching endlessly in every direction. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized that I was completely, hopelessly lost. Then, just when I thought I might scream, I saw something through the trees, a light flickering faintly in the distance. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding, desperate for any sign of civilization. As I drew closer, I saw that it was a small cabin nestled in a clearing. The windows glowed with a soft, inviting light, and smoke curled from the chimney. I hurried to the door and knocked, hoping that whoever was inside could help me find my way back. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He wore an old-fashioned park ranger uniform, but something about him seemed off. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were the same sickly yellow as the creature I'd seen in the woods. "You're far from the trail," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I got lost," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me get back?" He smiled, and my blood turned to ice. It was the same too wide, stretched smile I'd seen on the creature. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "You're safe here. For now." I stepped inside, feeling an odd sense of relief despite my fear. The cabin was warm, filled with the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic, like the tang of blood. I looked around and saw that the walls were covered in old photographs, black and white images of park rangers standing proudly in front of signs and trails. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The faces in the photos looked wrong. Their eyes were wide and empty, their smiles too large, too forced. What is this place?" I whispered. The ranger closed the door behind me, and I heard the click of a lock. "This is where we watch over the woods," he replied, his voice echoing oddly. "And now, you'll be joining us." I backed away, my heart racing as he moved closer. His face seemed to blur, shifting into something inhuman, something ancient and terrible. I turned and ran for the door, but when I pulled it open, the woods were gone. In their place was a vast, empty darkness that stretched on forever. I looked back, and the ranger was gone. I was alone in the cabin, surrounded by those terrible photos, their hollow eyes watching me, trapping me. The humming began again, louder and more insistent, filling the room like a living thing, and I realized then that I was never leaving this place. I'm still here, somewhere between the world I knew and the one that claimed me. If you find this, heed my warning. Don't stray from the marked trails. The forest is patient, and it knows how to lure you in. It's always watching, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander too far. I've always loved the woods. Ever since I was a kid, I'd find peace among the trees, miles away from the noise of civilization. So when I heard about a hidden campground up north, right near the border where the trees grow thick and the land feels ancient, I couldn't resist. I packed my tent, a few supplies, and headed out for what I thought would be a relaxing weekend. The drive was long, and by the time I reached the old ranger station at the edge of the forest, it was almost dark. The building looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew. Inside, a ranger sat behind the counter, staring at a map. "Camping?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah, thought I'd get a little peace and quiet," I replied, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. He looked at me then, his eyes sharp and wary. "Just stay on the main trail. Don't go wandering off." He held my gaze for a moment longer than felt comfortable before handing me a map with a spot marked on it. I followed his directions and found the site easily enough. It was tucked between a grove of pines, with just enough space for my tent and a small fire. I set up camp, got a fire going, and sat back, listening to the night sounds. Owls hooted in the distance and the wind rustled through the branches above. But then, just as the fire began to die down, I heard something else, a faint whisper just beyond the trees. I shook it off as my imagination, maybe the wind, and crawled into my tent. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispering grew louder, coming from every direction, filling my ears with sounds I couldn't understand. It wasn't words exactly, but something close, a low, guttural muttering that seemed to rise from the ground itself. I poked my head out of the tent and shone my flashlight into the woods. Shadows shifted between the trees, but I couldn't make out anything clearly. Just as I was about to go back inside, I saw something move, a shape, tall and dark, stepping behind a tree. I caught a glimpse of its eyes reflecting the light back at me, yellow and unblinking. My heart raced. I'd heard stories about creatures in these woods, stories people laughed about in daylight but whispered about in the dark. Skinwalkers, dogmen, beasts that weren't quite animal but definitely not human either. I laughed nervously to myself, telling myself it was just a deer or maybe a trick of the light, but I didn't really believe it. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-sleep and paranoia. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear the whispering, closer this time, and I'd sit up, flashlight in hand, searching for whatever was out there. Eventually, I drifted off, only to be awakened by the sound of footsteps around my tent, slow and deliberate, circling. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight, but didn't dare move. At dawn, I packed up, eager to leave, but the path back to my car felt different. The trees seemed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I could barely make out the trail, and every step felt like it was leading me deeper into the forest rather than out of it. I walked for what felt like hours, but no matter how far I went, the ranger station was nowhere in sight. Finally, just as panic was about to set in, I stumbled into a clearing. At the center was a stone circle, ancient and worn, with symbols carved into the rocks that I didn't recognize. I felt a chill as I realized I'd never seen this place before, not on the map or during my hike, and yet it felt familiar, like I was meant to find it. That's when I saw them, two figures crouched low and watching me from the shadows. They were human-shaped but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their eyes too bright, and they moved with an unnatural grace that made my skin crawl. They whispered to each other, that same guttural language I'd heard the night before, and one of them pointed at me, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. I backed away, but the path was gone. The trees had closed in, surrounding me. I was trapped. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, and as the creatures stepped closer, I felt a strange calm wash over me, as if I'd been here before, as if I'd always belonged here. And then I woke up. I was back in my tent, the morning light streaming through the fabric. For a moment I thought it had all been a nightmare, but when I stepped outside, the clearing was real, the stone circle exactly where I'd seen it. I ran back to the trail, desperate to find the ranger station, and after what felt like hours, I finally made it. The same ranger was there, looking up from his map with that same wary stare. "I told you not to wander off," he said, as if he knew exactly what I'd seen. I didn't say anything. I just got in my car and drove, vowing never to return. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the whispering, and I see those yellow eyes in the shadows. And I wonder if I ever really left that clearing. If maybe, just maybe, a part of me is still there, watching, waiting for the next poor soul who dares to wander into those woods. It started as a simple weekend getaway. I'd been feeling burnt out from work, and the idea of spending a couple of days off-grid sounded perfect. There's a place I'd been to once before, years ago, deep within the Thistle Creek woods. It's quiet, isolated, exactly what I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the tree line. As I walked down the narrow path leading to the clearing, I noticed how thick the forest felt, almost suffocating. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my footsteps on the damp ground. The trees seemed taller than I remembered, their twisted trunks forming strange shapes in the fading light. I shook off the unease and set up camp. By the time I got a fire going, the darkness had settled in, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. I'd been to plenty of secluded spots before, but something about this place felt different, like it was alive, watching me. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was just tired and jumpy. The first sign that something was off happened when I went to get more firewood. As I wandered around, flashlight in hand, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, shining my light through the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. I laughed at myself for being paranoid and continued picking up branches. Then I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct crunch like someone, or something, was walking just out of sight. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. Slowly I turned back toward the campsite, deciding I had enough firewood. I sat by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. The flames crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the trees, and then I heard a noise that made my skin crawl. It was a voice, calling my name from deep within the forest. It was my voice. "Eli," it called, mimicking the way I might call out to someone in the distance. "Eli, are you there?" I stared into the darkness, my heart racing. It didn't sound like an echo. It sounded intentional, like something was trying to lure me away from the safety of the fire. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight, stood up, and took a few steps toward the trees. "Hello?" I called, the word barely more than a whisper. I felt foolish, but I had to know. Silence. And then the voice called again, closer this time, with an eerie familiarity that sent chills down my spine. "Eli, come here." I shined my flashlight into the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood between the pines, maybe 20 feet away. At first I thought it was my own reflection in the beam, but then it moved, slowly, unnaturally. Its limbs were elongated, too thin, and its skin had a strange grayish pallor that seemed to shimmer in the light. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground, frozen in terror. The thing tilted its head, watching me, and then it smiled. Not a human smile. Its mouth stretched too wide, showing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as it took a step forward. It stopped, and I thought maybe it wouldn't follow me. But then it began to speak again, in my voice, but distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Eli, stay," it said, holding out one bony hand. I scrambled backward, nearly falling into the fire as I tried to put distance between myself and the creature. My mind raced, grasping for some explanation, but nothing made sense. I'd heard stories of skinwalkers and other cryptids, but I never believed any of it until now. I grabbed my backpack, frantically shoving everything into it, barely caring what I left behind. My hands trembled as I extinguished the fire, plunging the campsite into darkness. I didn't dare look back as I started down the trail, forcing myself to move even though every step felt like walking through quicksand. As I walked, I could hear it following me, that mimicry of my own voice echoing through the trees, calling my name in a chilling, mocking tone. I tried to pick up my pace, but I was disoriented, the path twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. My flashlight flickered and I swore under my breath, banging it against my palm. Then something new happened. A child's laughter, faint and eerie, drifted through the trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I could see a small shape ahead, standing just off the path. It was a child, or at least it looked like one, but there was something wrong with its face. Its eyes were too large, its grin too wide, stretching from ear to ear. It laughed again, tilting its head, and then it began to run toward me. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run before. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst out of the trees and into the clearing where I'd parked. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature following me. But there was nothing, just darkness, swallowing the road behind me. I reached the nearest town by morning and pulled over at a diner, still shaking, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I'd imagined it, but I knew that wasn't true. And then, as I took a sip of coffee, I caught my reflection in the window. At first, I thought it was just the trick of the light, but then I saw it. My reflection wasn't mimicking me. It was smiling. I looked down at my hands, but in the glass I saw those thin gray fingers and that too wide grin. I jumped up, shattering the coffee cup as I backed away from the window, but my reflection stayed there, staring back with that horrible, twisted smile. Now every time I look in a mirror, I don't know what I'll see. Sometimes it's just me. Other times, it's something else. Something that's been watching, waiting for me to slip up. And I know that if I ever see it again, it'll be the last thing I ever see. I thought a weekend camping trip would be the perfect way to unwind. Just me, the trees, and the quiet hum of nature. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no people. I'd heard about the dense woods around Pine Haven from a friend. He said it was isolated but beautiful, with trails that wound through towering pines and glades that looked untouched for centuries. Perfect, I thought. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The ranger station was empty, though a note on the door said they'd be back soon. Figuring I didn't need much help finding a good spot, I parked, grabbed my gear, and headed out. I chose a trail that promised scenic views about a mile in. By the time I reached a small clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch infinitely skyward, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky with a dim orange glow. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the silence. But something about that silence was off. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, not even a breeze. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged it off as city nerves and went to bed early. I woke around midnight to a low growl outside my tent. I froze. It sounded like no animal I'd ever heard. It was guttural, almost human. I peered through the tent's tiny window, but all I could see was darkness, thick and unyielding. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the growling had stopped. Just as I started to relax, I heard it again, closer this time. I couldn't stay in the tent. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where? I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. The air outside was dense and cold, unnatural for summer. I flashed my light around, searching for any sign of the creature. The beam caught on something, eyes reflecting back at me from the trees. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal. I took a step back, heart pounding, and heard the growl again, this time from behind me. I whipped around and found nothing there, but I felt it. I felt eyes watching me from every direction. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the darkness, the crunch of leaves and twigs snapping underfoot. I swung my light toward the sound, but it flickered and died. Panic surged through me as the footsteps circled closer, too fast to be human, too silent to be anything familiar. I ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. I stumbled onto a trail barely visible under the weak starlight. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to the car. After what felt like hours, I saw a light ahead. Relief washed over me as I recognized the ranger station. I pounded on the door, yelling for help. The door creaked open, and a man in a ranger's uniform stood there, his face partially shadowed. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice oddly calm. I heard something," I stammered. "There's something out there." He nodded slowly. "We get a lot of reports like that around here. Come on in." I stepped inside and he shut the door behind me. The room was small, cluttered with maps and camping gear, but there was an air of decay, a smell that was almost metallic. I turned to thank him, but something caught my eye. A pair of antlers hung on the wall above a shelf of strange trinkets, bones, feathers, odd-looking symbols scratched into wood. He noticed my stare and smiled. "You know, folks around here talk about creatures in these woods, skinwalkers, dogmen. They're all just legends, right?" I forced a laugh, but his eyes held mine too long, unblinking. "Right, just legends." He stepped closer, his gaze uncomfortably intense. "Thing is, those legends have a way of keeping folks in line. Keeps them from wandering where they shouldn't." I took a step back, but he was faster. He grabbed my arm, his grip icy and unnatural. I yanked free and ran for the door. As I threw it open, I heard him chuckling behind me, a sound that twisted in my ears like a scream. Outside, I ran back toward the trail, desperate to reach my car. But when I got to the clearing where I'd camped, I froze. My tent was gone, as if I'd never been there. Only an empty space remained, and the ground was undisturbed. I turned back toward the ranger station, but it was gone too. In its place stood trees, tall and silent, stretching endlessly in every direction. I was alone. Alone in a way that didn't feel natural, like the woods themselves were watching, waiting. I never found my way out. I wandered for days, or maybe it was hours. Time felt slippery. Every time I thought I saw a path or heard a voice, it vanished as soon as I got close. I could still hear that ranger's laugh, echoing through the trees, mocking me, telling me I'd gone where I shouldn't have. And now here I am, wandering these woods, watching as others make the same mistake I did. Because that's the thing about these woods. They're not just haunted, they're hungry. And now so am I. So if you ever find yourself in Pine Haven, and you see a ranger with cold eyes and a crooked smile, take my advice. Don't follow him. Turn back while you still can, because once you step into these woods, they never really let you leave. I'd always loved camping. There was something about being out there in the woods, miles from anyone or anything, that made me feel truly alive. My friends thought I was crazy, but solitude has always felt like an old friend to me. So when I heard about a place called Shadow Ridge, a remote spot up north known for its rugged beauty and untouched trails, I couldn't resist. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched through the trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and my own footsteps crunching along the gravel path. Perfect. It was everything I wanted. Isolated, wild, and eerie in a way that made my skin prickle with excitement. I set up my tent near a small clearing and got a fire going. As dusk settled in, the shadows grew longer, twisting and morphing as if they had a life of their own. I leaned back, watching the flames dance, letting my mind drift. I almost didn't notice the silence when it came. It was sudden, like someone had flicked a switch, cutting off the sounds of the forest. No crickets, no wind, nothing but the crackle of my fire. I listened, straining to hear something, anything, but the quiet was so absolute, it felt unnatural. I tried to shake it off as just the calm of the woods settling in for the night, but there was a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air that made my skin crawl. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard a whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but I could make out the words. "Help me," it said, a pleading, desperate tone that seemed to wrap around me like a cold mist. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating branches and leaves, but there was no sign of anyone. I called out, asking if someone was there, but my voice sounded small and hollow, swallowed by the vastness of the night. I told myself it was probably just the wind or an animal, and I sat back down, trying to convince myself I was alone. But that voice kept echoing in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A while later, just as I was starting to feel the weight of sleep pulling at me, I heard footsteps, slow, measured, crunching through the underbrush. They stopped and then started again, moving closer, circling around the edge of my camp. I stood up, flashlight in hand, heart racing as I scanned the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence that followed was so intense I could hear my own heartbeat. Then from the darkness came a low guttural growl. It was deep, almost a rumble, and it sent a chill straight through me. I'd heard animal sounds before, but this was different, more sinister, more aware. I took a step back, my eyes darting around, trying to catch sight of whatever was out there. That's when I saw it, a shadow just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin, like it had been stretched and twisted into some horrible shape. Its eyes glowed, reflecting the light of the fire, two pinpoints of malevolence staring straight at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, as it took a step forward, the firelight flickering across its gaunt, pale face. It looked almost human, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. It tilted its head, watching me with an unsettling curiosity, and then it spoke. Its voice was like broken glass, sharp and jagged, scraping through the night. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed, its mouth twisting into a grotesque imitation of a smile. I took a step back, nearly tripping over the log I'd been sitting on. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The creature's smile widened, and it took another step closer. "I am the shadow, the whisper, the unseen." Its voice seemed to echo around me, coming from everywhere at once. "I have always been here, waiting, watching." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. I grabbed a stick from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon, but the creature just laughed, a low, chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "Go ahead," it said, its eyes locked onto mine. "Run!" That was all I needed to hear. I bolted, dropping the stick and sprinting into the darkness, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. The trees closed in around me, branches tearing at my clothes, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the underbrush. Behind me I could hear it following, its footsteps slow, deliberate, almost as if it was toying with me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the trees all looked the same, stretching up like twisted claws against the night sky. I was lost, and I could still feel that thing's eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the darkness. And then I saw it. A small cabin, half hidden behind a thicket of bushes. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward it, hoping for some kind of shelter, some place to hide. I threw open the door, slamming it shut behind me, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was empty, just one room with a single chair and a broken table. I tried to steady myself, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the walls, scratched into the wood, were dozens of names like mine. I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating each one, and beneath each name was a date. The last name was mine. I backed away, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw the figure in the corner. It was just a shadow, but I knew it was watching me, waiting. A voice whispered in my ear, soft and cold. The unseen always sees, always follows. I felt a hand on my shoulder, icy and insubstantial, and then everything went black. I woke up in my tent, the morning sun filtering through the fabric. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw the scratches on my arm, deep, fresh, the shape of fingers burned into my skin. I packed up, not looking back as I left Shadow Ridge behind. Since then, every night I hear that voice, whispering my name, scratching at the edges of my mind. I see shadows where there shouldn't be any, and I know that I didn't leave that place alone. The unseen came with me, and now it's only a matter of time before it shows itself again. I should have known better than to wander off the trail, but, as they say, curiosity kills, or at least it comes close. This happened last fall during a hiking trip upstate, in a part of the Adirondacks that was known for its rugged beauty and isolation. I was out there with my girlfriend Sarah and our friend Mike, both of whom were experienced hikers. The plan was simple: hike up to the summit, camp for a night, and head back the next day. We were all looking forward to it, expecting nothing more than a weekend of fresh air and stunning views. But what we found was something I can barely bring myself to remember, let alone talk about. We started early in the morning, setting off on a trail that quickly turned from well-maintained paths to overgrown, narrow stretches. By mid-afternoon, we were miles into the wilderness, and that's when we spotted it, a small unmarked path veering off into the trees. The kind of path that looks like it's been there forever, but hasn't seen a human foot in years. Sarah suggested we stick to the main trail, but I was too intrigued. I convinced them it would be an adventure, and against their better judgment, they followed me. At first, the path was almost beautiful. It wound through a dense grove of old twisted trees, the kind with bark so thick it looked like armor. The air was still, almost too still, and there was this odd hush that seemed to settle over everything. I noticed the birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to avoid this part of the forest. It wasn't long before we stumbled across something that made us pause. An old, dilapidated cabin, barely visible through the trees. It looked ancient, like it had been forgotten long ago. The windows were shattered, and the roof sagged as if it were ready to collapse. There was something off about it, something that set my teeth on edge, but I couldn't help myself. I had to take a closer look. Mike tried to joke about it, saying it was the perfect place for a serial killer's hideout, but even he looked uneasy. We walked up to the cabin, and that's when we noticed the smell. It was thick and sour, like rotting meat left out in the sun, and it seemed to seep out from the cracks in the walls. Sarah gagged, and I felt my stomach churn, but there was this strange pull that kept me moving forward. I don't know why, but I pushed the door open, ignoring the way it creaked, as if it were protesting. Inside, the cabin was dark, despite the daylight outside. Dust hung in the air, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, old newspapers, and what looked like animal bones. At least, I hoped they were animal bones. As we stepped inside, the smell intensified, almost overwhelming. But I couldn't look away from the walls. They were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood with something sharp. The symbols were crude, almost childlike, but they didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. Mike muttered something about witchcraft, and Sarah just kept shaking her head, whispering that we needed to leave. And then we heard it, a soft shuffling sound from the back of the cabin. It was the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold, like someone dragging their feet. Mike stepped back, and I saw the fear in his eyes, but I was frozen, staring into the shadows. The shuffling grew louder, and then I saw it, a figure hunched and twisted emerging from the darkness. It was covered in matted fur, its limbs long and bony, but its face was almost human, almost. Its eyes locked onto mine, dark and hollow, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was staring into a void that could swallow me whole. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step sending a jolt of terror through me. And then it smiled, or at least I think it was a smile. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. Without a word, we turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and sprinting back to the trail. I could hear something behind us, something heavy, crashing through the underbrush as it followed. We didn't look back, we just kept running, adrenaline fueling our legs as we tore through the forest, our lungs burning and hearts racing. When we finally reached the main trail, the sound stopped. The forest was silent again, almost as if nothing had happened. We stood there, gasping for breath, too scared to speak, too scared to think. Eventually, we made our way back to the campsite, packed up our gear, and left. We didn't say a word the whole way home, and none of us have talked about it since. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still smell that cabin, that awful, rotting stench. And I wonder if whatever we saw that day is still out there, waiting for someone else to wander off the trail, waiting for someone else to take that wrong turn. Because I'm certain of one thing. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. I've been camping my whole life, grew up around these parts, so I know the woods pretty well, at least I thought I did. There's a little spot deep in the heart of the Blackwood Forest that's off the beaten path, perfect for an overnight stay away from the rest of the world. It's quiet, remote, and offers a view of the stars you can't get anywhere else. I set up camp in a small clearing. It was late afternoon, and the last light of the sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. I shrugged it off as just the trick of the light and got to work setting up my tent. I could almost hear my grandpa's voice in my head, reminding me to always finish camp prep before sundown. Once everything was in place, I settled by the fire with a cup of instant coffee, just listening to the woods. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. But then, there was something else. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, distant howl. I ignored it, figuring it was nothing more than a coyote far off. But soon it became clear that this was no ordinary sound. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, or just my mind playing tricks on me. I had heard plenty of animals in these woods before, but this felt different. The growling seemed to surround me, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My fire crackled and I jumped, heart pounding as I scanned the shadows. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted limbs looking more like claws than branches. I thought I saw movement, a shape flitting between the trees, but every time I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I'd heard stories growing up, tales of creatures that prowled these woods, skinwalkers, Dogman, things that could mimic voices, lure you deeper into the forest until you were lost forever. My grandpa used to tell me about them, always with a warning not to stray too far. "The woods have eyes, boy," he'd say. "They see more than you ever will." Back then, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Now I wasn't so sure. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on me like a heavy weight. I strained my ears, hoping to catch a reassuring sound, a bird, an owl, anything. But there was nothing. Then in the corner of my eye I saw something, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, far taller than any man, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed wrong, as if it didn't belong on any creature in this world. Its eyes were two burning embers, staring right into me. I froze, every muscle in my body locked as I tried to process what I was seeing. Then the thing started moving, but not like an animal or a human. It was almost as if it was gliding, its limbs bending in unnatural ways as it drew closer. I backed up, stumbling over my pack and nearly tripping into the fire, and then it spoke. The voice was unmistakably my own, but twisted, distorted. "Why did you come here?" it rasped. The creature mimicked my voice with eerie precision, but there was a mocking edge to it, like it was toying with me. I felt a surge of nausea as the thing took another step forward. I could see it more clearly now, its skin pale and stretched taut over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. Its eyes glowed with a hunger that I could feel in my bones. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it straight at the creature, and for a moment it recoiled, hissing like a snake. That was all the incentive I needed. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't try to figure out where I was going. I just bolted through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and tearing at my clothes as I pushed through the darkness. My mind was a blur, panic fueling my every step. But no matter how far I ran, that voice kept calling out, mimicking my words, my cries. "Help me!" it would scream in my own desperate tone. "Come back," it would whisper, softer this time, as if it were right behind me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke into another clearing. I collapsed, gasping for breath, and for the first time, dared to look behind me. The woods were silent, still. There was no sign of the creature, no glowing eyes, no twisted limbs. I almost laughed, half hysterical, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. As I stood there, catching my breath, I heard a familiar voice. It was my grandpa. "Boy, you shouldn't be here," he said. My heart skipped a beat as I whipped around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood my grandpa. He looked just as he had the last time I saw him years ago before he passed away. You're not real," I stammered, backing away, but he just smiled, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "The woods have eyes, boy," he said, his voice fading into a hollow echo as he turned and vanished into the trees. I finally made it back to my car at sunrise, my body aching, clothes torn, but alive. As I drove away, I felt the chill leave my bones, the warmth of the sun finally starting to seep in. I convinced myself it was over, just a nightmare brought on by isolation and fear. But when I got home, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked into my backpack, where I hadn't put it, was my grandpa's old hunting knife. I stared at it, trying to remember if I'd taken it from his house, but I knew I hadn't. I kept hearing his voice in my head, over and over, warning me about the woods. The woods have eyes, they see more than you ever will. Now I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home, that those burning eyes are still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Maybe next time I won't be so lucky. I never thought much about the old stories my grandfather told me as a kid. He used to sit by the fireplace, his face half hidden in shadows, recounting eerie tales about the Wendigo, the rake, and other unspeakable things that roamed the forests. He'd always end by warning me to stay away from the Blackwood Forest. But as the years passed, I chalked it all up to tall tales meant to keep kids from getting lost in the woods. I hadn't planned to go to Blackwood Forest that night. My friends and I were just looking for a secluded spot to camp and have a few drinks. We were in college, and the thrill of being somewhere so remote was exactly what we wanted. The forest wasn't far from my old hometown, and even though the warnings from my childhood echoed in the back of my mind, I pushed them aside, thinking it would all just add to the adventure. There were 5 of us, me, Sam, Lily, Mark, and his girlfriend, Anna. We arrived at dusk, setting up our tents near a clearing that seemed perfect, quiet, serene, untouched. We built a fire, laughed, told stories, and by midnight, we were all a little tipsy, staring up at the vast, star-studded sky. But as the night wore on, an uneasy silence settled over the group. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch too far, as if the darkness was swallowing the light. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere deep in the woods. At first we thought it might be a bear, but it didn't sound right. The growl was different. It was like a combination of a human voice and some kind of animal, a horrible rasping sound that made my skin crawl. We looked at each other, and I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. Mark, always the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight and said he'd check it out. Anna protested, but he brushed her off, laughing as he disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bobbing as he went. We waited, holding our breath, the silence stretching on uncomfortably. After a few minutes, we heard him call out, but his voice sounded wrong. It was shaky, frightened. "Guys, can you come here? I think I found something." We hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but then Anna got up, calling his name, and we all followed, our flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. We found him standing near a tree, staring down at something on the ground. As we got closer, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Its body was twisted, limbs contorted in ways that didn't seem possible, as if it had been crushed and stretched at the same time. Deep gashes marred its body and its eyes. Its eyes were missing. I forced myself to look away, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. "What could have done this?" Sam whispered, his face pale in the dim light. None of us had an answer, but we didn't have much time to think about it, because that's when we heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush. They sounded too heavy for a person, too calculated for an animal. We turned, shining our flashlights in every direction, but we couldn't see anything. Then a voice drifted through the trees, so soft we almost missed it. "Anna. Anna." It was Mark's voice, but he was standing right next to us, staring in horror. The voice called again, louder this time, and we all felt it, a deep, gut-wrenching fear that something was very, very wrong. I looked at Mark, and he was shaking, his eyes wide and terrified. That's not me," he stammered, taking a step back. The voice came again, closer now, calling for Anna, and I could see her eyes welling up with tears. She clung to Mark, and he held her close, trying to keep her calm. But then something moved in the trees, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. It was tall, much taller than any of us, with long, bony limbs that seemed to stretch forever. Its face was a hideous, distorted version of Mark's, like someone had taken a mask of his face and twisted it into something monstrous. It grinned at us, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I felt my legs turn to jelly, but instinct took over, and I grabbed Anna's hand, pulling her back toward the campsite. We all ran, stumbling and tripping over roots and rocks, the creature's laughter echoing behind us, a high-pitched, mocking sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When we reached the clearing, we found our tent shredded, the fire smothered, as if someone or something had torn through it in a rage. Sam was breathing heavily, looking around frantically, and Mark kept glancing back, his face pale and haunted. "What the hell was that?" Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. We didn't have time to answer, because then we saw it, the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those horrible glowing eyes. And this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them, each one a twisted, monstrous version of one of us, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of fear and pain. They took a step forward, moving in unison, their long limbs bending in ways that seemed impossible, their smiles growing wider with each step. I knew then that we were being hunted, that these creatures weren't going to let us leave the forest alive. We took off, running through the trees, the sounds of their footsteps thundering behind us, the echoes of our own terrified voices chasing us through the darkness. I don't know how long we ran, or how we managed to make it out. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, we were bruised, bleeding, and utterly exhausted. But when we turned back, the creatures were gone. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of their existence. We stumbled back to the car and drove in silence, each of us too shaken to speak. To this day, I can still hear them in my nightmares, calling my name, their twisted faces burned into my mind. None of us ever went back to Blackwood Forest, and we never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling and the shadows grow long, I swear I can hear them, whispering, laughing, waiting for the next fool to venture too deep into the darkness. I've been a park ranger in a small, desolate forest preserve in the Pacific Northwest for almost a decade. It's the kind of place where people only come to camp if they know about it, and most don't. The land is dense with thick pines, and the trails are unmarked and winding, looping back on themselves in strange ways as if they have a mind of their own. It's beautiful in the daylight, but when the sun sinks below the trees, the air gets heavy, and the woods transform into something else entirely. About a year ago, we started getting reports of something disturbing. Campers would show up at my office, wide-eyed and frantic, claiming they heard voices out in the woods, voices of their loved ones. They'd say they saw strange shadows, shapes that didn't move like animals or people should. I'd write down their stories, assure them we'd look into it, and for the most part, we'd chalk it up to overactive imaginations or too much whiskey around the campfire. But one night, I got a call on the radio from a young couple who had ventured way out past the designated campsite. They said they'd seen something that terrified them, and now they were lost. The woman, Emma, was sobbing, saying they'd heard footsteps circling their tent all night. They tried to leave, but the woods seemed to close in on them, making it impossible to find their way back. The man, Dave, was breathless, whispering that there was something stalking them. I took the call seriously. The last thing I wanted was a search and rescue mission for a couple who'd wandered into dangerous territory. I grabbed my flashlight, my gun, and some basic supplies, and headed out to their location. The night was moonless, and the trees cast shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like skeletal fingers around me. Every step felt like I was being swallowed deeper into a place that didn't want me there. As I trudged through the thick underbrush, the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, were eerily absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I'd heard stories of the things that supposedly roamed these trees, skinwalkers, dogmen, other creatures that defy logic and description. Local legend said they watched the forest, guarding it jealously, and those who wandered too far were never seen again. The radio crackled, and I could barely make out Dave's voice, whispering that they could see something watching them from the trees. He described it as tall, with glowing yellow eyes and a distorted face, like it was wearing the skin of something human, but it wasn't human at all. He went silent, and a chill ran down my spine. I was about 20 minutes from their location and picked up my pace. When I got to their campsite, I found their tent shredded to pieces, as if by enormous claws. There were deep, gouging marks in the earth around the site, tracks that looked like they were made by something with paws, but far larger than any wolf or bear. And then I saw the blood. It was splattered across the tree trunks and soaked into the dirt. There was no sign of Emma or Dave, just a deafening silence pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I was about to call for backup when I heard it. A voice. It sounded like Emma, calling my name. Her voice echoed through the trees, soft at first, then louder, almost frantic. I spun around, but the forest was empty. Her voice kept calling, closer now, but somehow off, distorted, like someone was imitating her but didn't quite know how a human was supposed to sound. I took a step back, and suddenly, there was a rustling from the bushes behind me. I turned, and there it was, a creature, hunched and covered in matted fur, with long, spindly limbs that didn't bend the right way. Its face was a horrible mash of animal and human features, with teeth that gleamed in the darkness, and those eyes glowing a sickly yellow, locking onto me as if they could see right through me. It took a step forward and then another, moving with an unnatural, jerking gait, like it was trying to mimic a human but failing. I aimed my gun, hands shaking, and fired a shot. The creature let out a shriek, an ear-piercing wail that echoed through the forest, sending a murder of crows flapping into the sky. It turned and disappeared into the shadows, its figure melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran, branches whipping my face, roots snagging at my feet, but I didn't dare slow down. When I finally made it back to my cabin, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and tried to steady my breathing. I wanted to radio for help, but when I picked it up, I froze. Through the static, I heard Emma's voice again, whispering my name, asking me to come back. She kept repeating it, over and over, until it faded into a deep, guttural growl. I never found Emma or Dave. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead. We closed that part of the park indefinitely, but that didn't stop the reports from coming in. Other campers claimed to see figures lurking in the shadows, and a few brave souls said they heard voices that sounded like their loved ones, calling them deeper into the woods. I still work as a ranger, though I don't patrol that area anymore. I don't go out after dark, and I never, ever respond to a voice calling my name from the trees. Because now, I know the truth. Whatever is out there, it's waiting, and it knows us. It remembers us, and it wears our faces, luring the unsuspecting into its lair. I can only hope you don't hear your name echoing through the woods, because if you do, it's already too late. The forest doesn't give back what it takes, and those who wander too far, well, they become part of the trees. I used to love camping. There was nothing like the feeling of being far from the buzz of city life, surrounded by nothing but the quiet serenity of nature. But that was before I took a solo trip to the Devil's Hollow, a stretch of dense forest well off the beaten path. Few ventured there, mostly because of the unsettling legends that had circulated for decades. People whispered about strange creatures that roamed the woods after dark, about voices calling from nowhere, about things that weren't quite human. I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales, the kind of stories meant to spook tourists and keep kids from wandering too far. But now I wish I had listened. I wish I had never gone to Devil's Hollow at all. It was late afternoon when I arrived and set up camp near a small clearing. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and pine. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and cooked myself a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I found the quiet, peaceful, almost hypnotic. But then, around midnight, I heard something strange. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It started off faint, but slowly grew louder, echoing through the trees. I stepped out of my tent and shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, just shadows dancing between the trunks. I figured it might be a woodpecker or some other nocturnal creature and shrugged it off, retreating back into my tent. As I lay there trying to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, closer this time, tap, tap, tap. My heart started to race. I told myself it was nothing, but then I heard a voice, faint and trembling, just outside my tent. "Help me!" The voice was barely a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. I sat up, straining to hear more. Again the voice called out, this time a little louder. "Please, help me." It sounded like a woman, but something about it was off. Her tone was hollow, like she was mimicking a human voice without really understanding how. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out with my flashlight, but there was no one there. Just the trees, silent and foreboding, stretching endlessly into the darkness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, with long limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like two orbs of molten gold. I froze, the beam trembling in my hand, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature moved in an unnerving, jerking manner, its limbs snapping and cracking as it shuffled closer. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The creature stopped a few feet from my tent, staring at me with those glowing eyes, unblinking. Then it opened its mouth, and the woman's voice came out again, even more distorted this time, like a recording being played backward. "Please, help me!" I stumbled backward, crawling out of the tent and scrambling to my feet. I grabbed my pack and took off, not caring which direction I was going, just desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. I could hear it following me, its limbs snapping as it moved through the underbrush, matching my pace with ease. My flashlight flickered, the batteries dying just as I needed them most, and I was left running blindly through the dark, branches clawing at my skin as I crashed through the woods. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I came to a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just the darkness pressing in around me. I was about to keep running when I saw something on the ground, a small tattered notebook. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. They were filled with scrawled notes, descriptions of strange creatures and diagrams of twisted, monstrous figures. But one page caught my attention. It was a warning, written in bold, shaky letters. They can't mimic what they don't know. Run if you hear your name. Run, and don't look back. Just then I heard my name, whispered so softly it was almost lost in the wind. I dropped the notebook, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice came again, closer now, more insistent. Come here, Alex. I need you. I bolted, not daring to look back, my mind racing with the realization that it wasn't just calling for help. It knew my name. Whatever it was, it knew who I was. I ran until dawn, finally emerging onto a narrow dirt road on the edge of the forest. I flagged down a passing truck, and the driver, a grizzled old man with weary eyes, looked at me with a mixture of pity and understanding. Devil's Hollow? He asked, and I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He nodded back as if he'd seen this before. You're lucky, he said. Most don't make it out. I've never gone back to those woods, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting, watching, calling for me in the voices of those it has already taken. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I can almost hear it, the soft tap, tap, tap of its footsteps as it searches for its next victim. I wasn't supposed to be out there alone, but I'd been feeling restless for days, and the woods had always been my escape. I told myself I'd only be gone for the afternoon, just long enough to clear my head. The forest stretched for miles, old-growth trees looming like silent sentinels, their twisted limbs knotted against the sky. I'd wandered these woods a dozen times before, but today felt different. There was an eerie stillness, a heavy silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. About an hour in, I stumbled upon a trail I'd never seen before. It was barely a path, more like a suggestion, weaving through the dense underbrush. Against my better judgment, I followed it. There was something almost hypnotic about the way it wound deeper into the forest, luring me forward. After a while, I came to a clearing. In the middle of it was an old stone well, surrounded by a ring of standing stones that looked ancient, weathered down by time. I stepped closer, curiosity overriding the prickle of fear crawling up my spine. The stones had carvings on them, strange symbols I couldn't recognize. Some looked like faces twisted in agony, others like animals with far too many limbs. As I traced my fingers over one of the stones, I heard a noise, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the well. I leaned over, trying to see inside, but it was nothing but an endless black void. And then, from the darkness, I heard a voice. It was a whisper, just on the edge of hearing, but somehow I understood it. It said my name. I staggered back, heart racing. I could feel eyes on me, but I couldn't see anyone. The shadows around the clearing seemed to shift, almost like they were alive, creeping closer, drawn to the sound of my name echoing from the well. I turned to leave, but the path I'd come down was gone. I was surrounded by trees on all sides, their trunks now twisted and blackened as if burned by some invisible fire. Panic surged through me as I spun in circles, searching for a way out. Every direction looked the same. The tapping started again, louder now, closer. I glanced back at the well, and what I saw still haunts me. A hand was reaching out from the darkness, pale and skeletal, its fingers impossibly long, almost insect-like. It crawled over the edge of the well, pulling with it something that looked vaguely human, but wrong. Its body was hunched, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its face, God, that face. It was like someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory, but had forgotten what a human looked like halfway through. Its eyes were wide, bulging, empty, and yet they seemed to see straight through me. I backed away, but the creature moved with a grotesque, lurching speed, closing the distance between us. I could smell it now, a sickly sweet odor like decaying flowers and rotting meat. It reached out, its fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt a coldness seep into my skin, spreading like ice through my veins. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. All I could do was stare into those dead, hollow eyes as they filled my mind with images of things I couldn't understand. Dark forests filled with more of those creatures, twisted bodies hanging from the trees, strange rituals around that very well. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I broke free, stumbling backward and running blindly through the trees. I don't know how long I ran, only that I didn't stop until I saw the familiar dirt road at the forest's edge. I collapsed there, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. By the time I made it back to my car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I looked back at the woods, half expecting to see that thing watching me from the tree line, but there was nothing, just the silent trees swaying in the wind. I drove home in a daze, replaying everything in my mind, trying to convince myself that it hadn't really happened. But when I looked in the mirror later that night, I saw it. The faint outline of a handprint on my arm, dark and bruised, as if something had tried to pull me back. I've been back to the edge of those woods a few times since then, but I can never find that path again, nor the well, nor the clearing with the standing stones. And yet, I feel it calling to me, pulling at the edges of my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same faint tapping, echoing from somewhere far away. But the worst part, I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The forest may seem empty, but something watches from the shadows, waiting, patient. And I can still hear it, faint as a whisper, calling my name. I always thought I was a rational person. Science, logic, facts, those were my tools. So when my cousin Rachel told me she'd found an old cabin out in the woods, a place she thought would make for an interesting weekend getaway, I wasn't worried. I figured it was just another run-down relic, forgotten by time, but that was part of the charm. Besides, Rachel was always into this kind of stuff, finding these strange, abandoned places and exploring them. This time, she wanted me along. She called it the Lost Cabin, saying that it had a strange history and was rumored to be haunted. I laughed it off. Haunted or not, I figured it would be fun to check out. We drove out early in the morning, parking at the edge of the woods and hiking in. The trees were dense, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. Rachel led the way, navigating with an old map she'd found in some dusty antique store. I could feel the silence pressing in around us, thick and heavy, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. But I kept telling myself it was just nerves, just the thrill of exploring the unknown. After about an hour, we found it. The cabin was half hidden by overgrown vines and moss, barely visible among the trees. It looked ancient, older than any building I'd ever seen, with its wooden walls weathered and warped, the roof caved in on one side. It was like something out of a nightmare, yet I felt strangely compelled to go inside. The door creaked open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. The air was thick, musty, with a scent that was a mix of mold and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. I could see strange symbols carved into the walls, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Rachel was fascinated, snapping photos with her phone, chattering excitedly about how this place was a goldmine for her blog. I tried to match her enthusiasm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We split up to explore the place, Rachel taking the upstairs, while I stayed on the ground floor. The cabin wasn't large, but every step felt like it took me deeper into some forgotten corner of the world. I found myself in a small room at the back, empty except for a cracked mirror on the wall and a small table. On the table was a notebook, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it and my heart skipped a beat. The pages were filled with drawings of creatures, things that looked almost human but twisted, distorted. Some had elongated limbs, others had too many eyes, too many teeth. Scrawled beneath the drawings were phrases that made my blood run cold. It watches, it waits, it knows your name. I felt a chill, as if a cold hand had brushed against my neck. I turned around, but there was no one there. That's when I heard Rachel scream. I ran upstairs calling her name, but there was no answer. The only sound was the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet and my own ragged breathing. I found her in a bedroom staring at the wall, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at, a large wooden wardrobe in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. Without thinking, I walked over and pulled the doors open. Inside was a tattered coat hanging from a rusty hook, and beneath it, a trapdoor set into the floor. I looked back at Rachel, but she didn't move. She just kept staring as if in a trance. I knew we should leave, that we'd already seen enough, but something compelled me to open that trapdoor. The hinges groaned as I lifted it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A faint, sickly sweet smell wafted up, a mix of decay and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, but then I heard a sound, a low guttural growl coming from the depths below. My stomach twisted, but curiosity overpowered my fear, and I took the first step down. The darkness swallowed me as I descended, the air growing colder, thicker. I could barely see, but I kept going, one step at a time, until I reached the bottom. I found myself in a small circular room with walls made of rough stone. In the center was a pit, and around it more of those strange symbols carved deep into the stone. Before I could react, I heard a scuffling sound behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. A figure lurking just beyond the edge of the pit, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a hood. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them on me, cold and hungry. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. And then it spoke, in a voice that was barely a whisper yet echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs, my breath coming in gasps. I reached the top, slamming the trapdoor shut, and looked around for Rachel. She was gone. I called her name, running through the rooms, but there was no trace of her, no sign that she'd ever been there. I stumbled out of the cabin and into the woods, the trees seeming to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching for me like claws. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until I finally collapsed on the forest floor. When I looked up, the cabin was gone. There was nothing but trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I made it back to town eventually, though I don't remember how. I told the police, but they didn't believe me. No one did. They searched the woods but found nothing. No cabin, no Rachel, nothing but empty forest. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been back to the woods since, but sometimes late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of a figure just outside my window, tall and hooded, watching, waiting. And every time I hear that same whisper echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Now I know I didn't just lose Rachel in those woods. I lost a part of myself. Something followed me out, something that shouldn't be here, something that knows my name. And somehow, I know it won't rest until I come back. I've been a park ranger for almost 5 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. I've dealt with wild animals, reckless campers, and the occasional ghost story passed around by my fellow rangers, but none of that prepared me for what happened in the thick woods of Black Pine. It all started a week ago. I was assigned the graveyard shift, patrolling the eastern sector, which is notoriously dense and rarely visited by tourists. It was just me, my flashlight, and the low hum of the radio. It was cold for early autumn, and the fog sat thick between the trees like a living thing, curling around trunks and branches, obscuring my view. Around midnight, I started hearing strange sounds. At first, it was just a low rustling. Probably a deer, I thought. But as I walked further, I heard a faint whistle, melodic and almost human. I called out, but no one answered, just the silence of the trees and the suffocating fog. I kept moving, my senses heightened, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. Suddenly, my radio crackled. I lifted it, expecting a routine check-in, but instead, I heard what sounded like breathing, slow, raspy breaths, dragging through the speaker. Then a voice, garbled and too deep, muttered my name. That was enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. The radio crackled again, but this time there was nothing but static. I shook it, trying to clear the interference, but the static persisted. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in around me as if the trees themselves were closing in, pushing me further into the unknown. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees about 30 feet ahead. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and covered in matted fur that looked almost like bark. Its eyes glowed, 2 pinpricks of yellow light that pierced through the fog. My flashlight barely illuminated its face, but what I did see made my blood run cold. It had the snout of a dog but elongated, almost wolf-like, and its lips were curled back in a sneer that showed too many teeth. The creature let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones, and I realized I was holding my breath. I took a step back, and it took one forward, never breaking eye contact. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face and tangled in my hair, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glimmer of the ranger station's lights in the distance. I collapsed inside, locking the door behind me, my chest heaving, heart racing. I told my supervisor, Greg, about what I'd seen, but he just chuckled and chalked it up to exhaustion. "Cryptids in Black Pine? Come on, you've been watching too many horror movies," he said with a smirk. I wanted to believe he was right, that it was just my imagination, but something about those yellow eyes stayed with me. Over the next few nights, I kept my encounters to myself, but each shift grew stranger. I'd find claw marks on trees, too high and too deep for any known animal. I'd hear whispers in the distance, always just out of earshot, luring me deeper into the woods. And then, last night, I found the footprints. They were enormous, nearly twice the size of my boot, with clawed toes that dug into the earth. I knelt down, examining them, and noticed something odd. The prints didn't look like they were walking. They looked like they were dancing, as if something had been circling in the same spot for hours. My flashlight flickered, and I heard that whistle again, this time closer. It was haunting, almost beautiful, but there was a rawness to it that sent chills down my spine. I glanced up, and there it was again, standing just beyond the circle of light. This time it wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside it, taller, thinner, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. They watched me, unblinking, as if they were waiting for something. And then the twist, the one thing that made me question everything I thought I knew. I heard my own voice. It came from one of the creatures, echoing back to me like a distorted recording. "Come closer," it said in my voice, but wrong, as if someone were mocking me. It was then that I realized these things weren't just creatures of flesh and bone. They were something else, something that could mimic, could learn. They were studying me, and I had no idea for how long. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be found. Just the suffocating realization that these things knew me, perhaps better than I knew myself. I managed to stagger back to the station, locking myself inside and trying to convince myself that it was over. But as I sit here now, I can still hear the whistle, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the trees. They're calling me back, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. Each night, they get closer, and each night, the line between my reality and theirs blurs a little more. If you're ever near Black Pine and you hear a whistle or see yellow eyes watching from the dark, don't go looking, because they'll find you first, and once they do, they never let go. They're not creatures of this world. They're echoes, shadows of something far older, far darker, that lurks just beyond the trees. And when they look at you, it's not just to hunt, it's to replace. So I'm warning you now, if you ever find yourself in Black Pine, stay on the trails and never go looking for what lies beyond. Because if you do, you might just find that it's been waiting for you all along. I always thought of myself as the outdoorsy type, the kind of person who feels alive only when surrounded by the sounds of nature. That's why when my buddy Tom suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. He'd found this secluded spot, far from any trails, somewhere where the stars would be clearer than we'd ever seen them, he said. It was an old hunting ground, supposedly, and he'd heard about it from a local back in town. As soon as we arrived, though, I felt something off. The trees pressed in too close, almost as if they were hiding secrets in their shadows. But I shook it off. Tom and I set up our tent, got a fire going, and by the time the first stars dotted the sky, I'd managed to push my unease to the back of my mind. We were sitting around the fire, swapping ghost stories like we always did, when we heard it. A low, guttural growl, somewhere in the darkness just beyond the firelight. We both stopped talking, our words hanging unfinished in the night air. I laughed a little too loud, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, probably a coyote or something, I told Tom. He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the dark, scanning the shadows. After a few minutes, we started talking again, but the mood had changed. The fire seemed dimmer, the trees closer. I was telling a story about some urban legend when Tom stiffened, his face pale. I followed his gaze and saw it too, a pair of glowing eyes staring at us from the edge of the firelight about 20 feet away. They were too high off the ground to belong to a coyote or even a wolf. And then they blinked, and the thing stepped closer, just enough that we could see the outline of its shape. It looked like a man, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its body too lean. It was covered in matted fur, with a snout that was somewhere between a dog's and a human's. It reminded me of those old drawings of werewolves, the ones you'd see in dusty horror novels. I could barely breathe, could barely think. Tom was whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. I don't know. The creature took another step forward, and I saw its mouth, rows of sharp, yellowed teeth set in a twisted, almost mocking grin. It snarled again, the sound vibrating through my chest, and I knew we had to run. I grabbed Tom, yanking him up, and we bolted into the woods, leaving the fire, our tent, everything behind. The night swallowed us, the darkness around us so thick it was like running blind. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, its heavy clawed feet tearing up the ground. I don't know how long we ran. Time felt twisted, stretched thin. All I knew was the pounding of my heart and the rasp of my breath. Somehow we stumbled upon an old cabin, barely more than a shack. The door hung open, creaking on rusty hinges. We darted inside, slamming the door shut and shoving an old dresser in front of it. I could hear the thing outside sniffing, scratching at the walls. The entire shack felt fragile, like it could collapse at any moment. In the faint moonlight filtering through the broken windows, I saw strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that didn't make any sense, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to writhe when you looked at them too long. Tom noticed them too, his face going even paler. He muttered something about them being wards, maybe, to keep something out, or in. And then the scratching stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating. I thought maybe it had given up, that we were safe. But then there was a thud, a heavy, wet sound, like something being dragged. I heard Tom whisper, "What is that?" But before I could answer, we saw it. a second pair of eyes glowing from the corner of the room far too close. We'd walked right into a trap. The creature stepped out from the shadows, identical to the one outside, with the same twisted grin, the same impossibly long limbs. It looked at us, almost as if it were amused. Behind us, the door burst open, and I realized too late that there were more than just two. The growls filled the shack, the sound echoing off the walls as more of them emerged from the shadows, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember much of anything after that. I woke up the next morning, alone in the clearing, with the sun filtering through the trees. I was lying in the dirt, the fire long since burned out. Tom was gone. I searched for him, but there was no sign, no tracks, nothing but silence and the lingering scent of something rotten. I found my way back to town, dazed and half mad, trying to tell someone what happened, but no one believed me. I went back the next day with the police, but the clearing was empty. The tent, our supplies, even the fire pit. It was all gone, like we'd never been there. It wasn't until later, when I was flipping through a dusty old book in the library, that I saw the symbol, the same writhing spiral I'd seen carved into the shack walls. The book described it as an ancient ward against creatures that wore human skins, things that looked like us but weren't us. Skinwalkers, it called them. The last thing I found buried in the book's pages was a warning. Once you've seen them, they don't let you go. I've tried to forget, tried to move on, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I see them. Out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of those glowing eyes, and I know they're still watching, waiting. Tom never came back. But sometimes late at night I hear his voice calling my name from the woods, and I know I'll never escape. I've been a park ranger at Blackwood Forest for nearly 10 years now. It's not the biggest or the most popular forest out there, but it has its secrets. There's a heavy silence that blankets the trees, as if they're hiding something they don't want to talk about. I'm supposed to be the one in charge, but out here I feel more like a visitor than a guardian. My shift that night was supposed to be routine. We had reports of some hikers going off trail, so I was asked to patrol the north side, where the forest gets thick and tangled, and where people sometimes lose their way. I started my trek just after sunset, armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a radio, and my trusted knife. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, just beyond the reach of my light. As I moved deeper into the forest, I noticed strange things that weren't there the last time I'd patrolled this area. I found claw marks on the trees, deep and jagged, like something big had been sharpening its talons. Then I stumbled across a pile of bones picked clean and bleached white. They weren't animal bones. They were too large, too twisted. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew I should have turned back right then and there, but something kept pulling me deeper, an invisible thread drawing me into the heart of the woods. About an hour in, I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the trees. It was followed by a faint rustling, like something big was moving through the underbrush. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but all I saw were shadows twisting between the trees. That's when I saw a figure standing just at the edge of my light. A tall, gaunt shape, with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. I called out, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to one side like it was trying to understand what I was. The air grew thick, and I could barely breathe. Then it smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide. My stomach churned as I realized this was no human. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers too long, and its skin was mottled, almost translucent. I took a step back, and that's when it started to move, mimicking my every motion with an eerie, jerky precision. It was as if it was toying with me, studying me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was headed, as long as it was away from that thing. But the further I ran, the more the forest seemed to close in on me, the trees bending and twisting, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The radio on my belt crackled to life, but instead of hearing my fellow rangers, all I heard was static, interspersed with what sounded like whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, like something was mocking me. I tried to call for help, but all that came through were those twisted, unsettling murmurs. I stumbled into a small clearing, my flashlight flickering as if it was on its last legs. That's when I saw them. More of those creatures, circling the clearing, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Each one looked different, yet somehow the same. Some were taller, others shorter, but they all shared that same grotesque grin and those two long limbs. I backed up against a tree, clutching my knife, knowing it was a feeble weapon against whatever these things were. As they moved closer, the air around me grew colder, and a faint, sickly sweet smell filled my nostrils like decaying flowers. I felt my vision blur, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the darkness, familiar faces, my own face twisted and deformed, staring back at me with those glowing eyes. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the creatures vanished, melting back into the shadows. The forest was silent again, but I knew better than to believe I was alone. I ran, blindly crashing through the underbrush until I saw the faint glow of my ranger station in the distance. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. But as I stood there trying to catch my breath, I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. My eyes, there was something wrong with them. They seemed darker, almost like they were glowing, and that grin, it was still there, lingering on my lips as if it belonged to someone else. I knew then that I hadn't escaped, not really. Those creatures had taken something from me, twisted me in some way I couldn't understand. I still do my rounds, still patrol the woods, but I'm not the same. Every night I hear those whispers on the radio, calling me back into the forest, back to where I lost myself. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in the shadows, I see those eyes staring back at me, glowing like embers, watching, waiting. I know they're still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, and that one day they'll come back for me. Because once you've seen them, once they've seen you, you're never truly free. You're part of the woods now, just like them. I work as a backcountry camping guide. I've spent most of my life in the woods, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about these places, until last summer. I was leading a small group on a 5-day trek through Cedar Hollow, one of the oldest forests in the region. It's a dense, almost impenetrable stretch of wilderness filled with ancient trees that seem to bend toward you, whispering secrets you don't want to hear. We had set up camp on the second night, deep in the heart of the woods. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that slithered between the trees. My group, a mix of seasoned campers and weekend adventurers, was huddled around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. I was on edge, though. There was a strange feeling in the air, a heaviness I couldn't quite place. As the evening wore on, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound like something dragging itself through the underbrush. It was distant at first, so I brushed it off as an animal foraging for food, but the noise grew louder, closer and more deliberate, like someone was watching us. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, but saw nothing. The others were oblivious, too engrossed in their conversations to notice. Around midnight, everyone had turned in for the night. I stayed up, staring into the embers, that uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The night was unnaturally still, and the usual chorus of crickets and owls was absent. Then I heard it again, the shuffling, this time accompanied by a low, raspy breathing. I turned my flashlight on and swept it across the trees, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness, revealing nothing but twisted branches and shadows. As I turned back toward the camp, I caught a glimpse of something. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, there was a figure standing between the trees. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs too long, and joints that bent in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and taut, stretched over its skeletal frame like a thin sheet of paper. But its face, that was the worst part. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to suck in the darkness and a mouth that stretched into a sickening grin filled with jagged teeth. I blinked and it was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of something rotten. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games. But deep down, I knew it was real. The next morning I didn't mention what I saw. I figured there was no need to scare anyone unnecessarily. We packed up and continued our trek, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lurking just out of sight. On the fourth day, as we made our way through a particularly dense part of the forest, we found something strange. A circle of trees, each one marked with a strange symbol carved deep into the bark. It looked almost like an eye, with jagged lines radiating from the center. My stomach twisted as I realized the trees were arranged in a perfect circle, surrounding a mound of dirt that looked freshly disturbed. One of the campers, a guy named Tom, joked about it being a burial site, but no one laughed. There was something wrong about that place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We moved on quickly, but I could feel those empty sockets watching us, could sense that grin lingering just beyond the trees. That night we set up camp by a stream, hoping the sound of running water would drown out the silence. But as soon as darkness fell, the shuffling started again. It circled our camp, staying just out of sight, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my knife, my ears straining to catch every sound. At one point I thought I saw it standing at the edge of the camp, watching us with that awful grin, but when I blinked, it was gone. The last day we hurried through the woods, desperate to put distance between ourselves and whatever was stalking us. We reached the edge of the forest by late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the trees, a welcome relief after days of darkness. I was the last to leave, bringing up the rear to make sure no one was left behind. As I stepped onto the trail, I looked back one last time. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was the figure. It raised a bony hand and pointed at me, its mouth stretching into that grotesque grin, as if to say it would see me again. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at the ranger station. I quit my job a week later. The others, they laughed it off as a strange experience, a creepy story to tell at parties. But I knew better. I knew that thing was still out there, waiting for its next prey. And sometimes late at night I hear it outside my window, the shuffling, the raspy breathing. It's waiting, and I know it will come for me someday. Out there in the woods, something unnatural walks at night. It watches, it waits, and if you're unlucky enough to catch its eye, it never lets you go. I've been a park ranger for almost 10 years, but this was the first time I'd been assigned to this remote section of the forest. It was supposedly one of the oldest stretches, untouched by time and seldom visited. No marked trails, no maps, just miles and miles of dense, tangled trees, the kind of place where light barely pierced through the canopy, and silence clung to everything like mist. They called it the Grey Woods, though no one seemed to know why. The rumors varied, from ancient curses to supernatural guardians protecting sacred land. I'd heard the whispers from the older rangers, but I'd always brushed them off. I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. I believed in what I could see and what I could touch. That was until my first night alone out there. I set up my camp by a small, stagnant pond. The air was thick and heavy, like I was breathing in the woods themselves. As I settled in, I noticed the usual forest sounds were absent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a deep, pervasive silence. It felt like the trees were watching me, their twisted trunks looming in strange, unnatural shapes. I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized there was a pattern to it. 3 slow, heavy knocks, like something was pounding the earth. I sat up, every muscle tense, and held my breath, listening. Another 3 knocks, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, just darkness. The next morning I found strange marks around my camp. They looked like large clawed footprints, but they weren't like anything I'd ever seen. Too big to be a bear, too wide to be a wolf. I felt a chill run through me as I traced them around the campsite. Whatever had made those prints had circled me over and over as I slept. As the day went on, I kept hearing strange noises, low growls in the distance, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the time dusk rolled around, I'd convinced myself it was just the isolation. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, something was watching me. It looked like a man at first, tall and thin, but when I focused on it, I saw that its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like a puppet on strings. It ducked back into the shadows as soon as I made eye contact. I tried to follow it, but as soon as I stepped into the tree line, the temperature dropped and the air turned thick and cloying, almost impossible to breathe. I felt like I was being swallowed by the forest, the branches closing in, the ground pulling at my feet. I forced myself back to camp, every step a struggle, like I was wading through quicksand. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the dying fire, clutching my flashlight, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for it to return. When dawn finally broke, I knew I had to get out. I packed my gear in record time and started down the path I'd come from. But the woods seemed different, like the trees had shifted while I slept. Landmarks I remembered from the day before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar clearings and twisted paths. It felt like the forest itself was alive, leading me in circles, trapping me. That's when I heard the laughter, high-pitched and hollow, echoing through the trees. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. Shadows moved just beyond my vision, always just out of reach, shapes that flickered and shifted like smoke. Then I saw it again, that same figure from before, but closer this time. It wasn't alone. Standing beside it was another creature, hunched and covered in matted fur, with a face that was almost human but twisted into something monstrous. Its eyes were too large, too bright, filled with a kind of malevolent intelligence that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back and the world spun. I found myself on the ground, looking up at the canopy, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Carved into the trees above me were symbols, strange runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow. They looked almost like faces, twisted into expressions of agony and fear. The ground beneath me started to shift, and I realized with horror that I was lying on a bed of bones, half buried in the undergrowth. I scrambled to my feet, my mind reeling. The trees around me seemed to twist and stretch, closing in, their branches reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I ran, blindly, through the forest, the laughter following me, echoing off the trees. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were on fire. But I kept running until I broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the woods were silent again, the darkness retreating like a bad dream. But I knew what I'd seen, and when I looked down, I realized I wasn't alone. Clinging to my shirt was a small carved wooden figure, identical to the symbols I'd seen on the trees. I don't know how I got out of those woods or what I encountered there, but sometimes late at night I hear the knocking again. 3 slow, heavy knocks just outside my door. And I know that the Greywoods haven't let me go. Not really. I left something behind and they won't stop until they've taken it back. So if you ever find yourself out there, alone in the woods, and you hear that sound, turn back. Don't look. Don't listen. Just run. Because once you see them, they never let you go. And trust me, you don't want to know what happens if they do. I've always loved the quiet of the woods at night. There's a sort of peace out there with only the stars and the wind keeping you company. That's why I signed up to be a park ranger, to be away from the noise and chaos of the city. But after what I experienced in those woods last year, I've started to think there's something more than peace lurking out there in the dark. It was late fall, the trees bare, their branches like skeletal fingers against the night sky. I was on patrol, my flashlight cutting through the mist that hung heavy in the air. I was following up on a report from a couple of campers who'd claimed they'd seen something unnatural near the old fire tower. The way they described it, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a dog or maybe a wolf, made me chuckle at first. I chalked it up to too many ghost stories around the campfire, but I had to check it out anyway, if only to put their minds at ease. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and decay, and each step I took felt heavier than the last, like the forest didn't want me there. I'd been to the fire tower plenty of times, but that night, something felt wrong. The silence was too deep, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like the world was holding its breath. I was about halfway to the tower when I heard it, a low guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate the ground beneath my feet. I froze, my heart racing as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just shadows on shadows moving like dark water. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, though deep down, I knew that sound wasn't natural. I pressed on, but the further I went, the more things seemed off. Strange markings appeared on the trees, deep scratches that looked almost like letters but in no language I'd ever seen. The kind of marks that seemed more deliberate, like someone or something had carved them with purpose. And then I saw them. At first they looked like eyes glowing in the darkness, two pinpricks of red that flickered like dying embers. But as I got closer, I realized they were part of something bigger, something crouched low to the ground, watching me. My flashlight caught a glimpse of it, a massive shape covered in matted fur, its face a twisted fusion of man and beast, with a long, narrow snout and rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, almost tripping over a root as it rose to its full height, towering over me, its limbs impossibly long and spindly, like the bones had been stretched too far. It let out a howl, a sound that seemed to split the night in two, reverberating through the trees. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound dug into my brain, filling my head with a primal terror that left me paralyzed. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows like smoke. I should have turned back then, but something drew me on, some morbid curiosity that kept my feet moving, even as my mind screamed at me to run. I reached the fire tower, but the structure looked different, almost decayed, as if it had been abandoned for years. I knew that wasn't possible. I'd been there just a few weeks before, but the wood was rotting, the metal rusted, and the door hung off its hinges. I climbed the steps, my flashlight flickering as I ascended. The higher I went, the colder it got, until I could see my breath clouding in front of me. When I reached the top, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The floor of the tower was covered in bones. Animal bones, mostly, but there were others, small and fragile, scattered like offerings around a large, flat stone. And on that stone was a carving, an intricate design of interlocking circles and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Before I could react, I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, like something was following me up. I spun around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of movement, a flash of fur and claw. I backed away, my heart pounding, and then I felt it, something cold and sharp against my back. I turned, expecting to see another creature, but there was nothing, just the open air and the forest stretching out below. That's when I realized the tower was gone. I was standing in the middle of the forest, with no sign of the structure around me, just trees and mist as far as I could see. I don't know how I got down, but suddenly I was on the ground, the world spinning around me. I stumbled back through the trees, each step more desperate than the last, until I finally broke through the edge of the forest and collapsed onto the dirt road. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and the sun was filtering through the trees. The woods looked normal again, almost peaceful, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. And since that night, I haven't been back to those woods, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that howl again, distant and faint, but unmistakable. And I know that whatever it is, it's still out there, hunting in the darkness. So if you ever find yourself near those woods, heed my warning. Stay out of the fire tower, because once you've heard the hollow howl, there's no escape. It will follow you, haunt you, and eventually, it will claim you.